Welcome, dear listener, to this journey through the culinary world of medieval times. As you settle in for rest, picture a simple cottage tucked into the countryside, its walls made of wattle and daub, its roof thatched with straw. Inside, a smoky fire burns low, and a family gathers around a wooden table. Upon it lies their meal, a bowl of porridge, a loaf of coarse bread, and perhaps, if fortune has smiled that day, a small piece of meat. This is the daily reality of the medieval peasant's table. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, food was not a matter of variety or pleasure, but of survival. The diet was plain, repetitive, and often inadequate. Grains formed the backbone of nearly every meal. Porridge, sometimes called pottage, was a staple, made by boiling whatever grains were at hand, thickened with peas or beans, and flavored with herbs when available. Bread, too, was ever present, though rarely the soft, fluffy loaves we imagine today. Instead, it was dense, dark and heavy, baked from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat bread, lighter and whiter, was mostly reserved for the wealthy. Imagine tearing into a loaf, so tough it could last for weeks. Its crust hard enough to dull a knife. This was the reality for peasants, who often relied on bread not just as food, but as a utensil. Thick slabs of stale bread, known as trenchers, served as plates, soaking up broths and stews before being eaten or discarded to animals. Even in its humblest form, bread was the anchor of sustenance. But bread and porridge alone could not fill every belly with nourishment. Vegetables, when available, added some variety, though they were limited by season and climate. Onions, leeks, and cabbages were hardy crops that survived the cold and became essential ingredients in peasant cooking. Carrots, parsnips, and turnips added color and texture to stews, though these were far from the sweet, tender vegetables we enjoy today. Fruits were rare in winter months, with apples and pears being stored as long as possible or dried to last through the lean seasons. Protein was harder to come by. Meat was a rarity, treasured more as a luxury than an everyday staple. A family might keep a pig, chickens, or a cow, but slaughtering them was reserved for special occasions, feasts, or emergencies. Every part of the animal was used: organs, bones, and scraps became soups and sausages. Even so, a peasant might go months without tasting meat. More often, their protein came from legumes, peas, beans, and lentils, which could be dried and stored. Fish offered another source of nourishment, particularly in regions near rivers, lakes, or the sea. Yet even here, access was unequal. Fresh fish was scarce for the poor, who more often encountered salted, smoked, or dried varieties. Herring, cod, and eel were common, packed into barrels with heavy layers of salt to preserve them. The flavor, by modern standards, was overpowering and harsh, yet it was better than hunger. Spices, so cherished by the nobility, were out of reach for most peasants. Cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg, and ginger were treasures imported from distant lands, worth more than their weight in gold. For ordinary families, flavor came instead from what could be grown locally: garlic, mustard seeds, onions, and simple herbs. Vinegar was a frequent addition, adding tang to otherwise bland dishes. The absence of spice meant that medieval peasant cuisine was often described as monotonous, its flavors plain and earthy. Food preservation posed another challenge. Without refrigeration, fresh produce and meats spoiled quickly. To survive winter, peasants relied on drying, salting, fermenting, and pickling. Sauerkraut provided vitamin C in the cold months. Dried beans and peas could be stored in sacks. Apples might be strung from rafters to keep them from rotting too soon. Yet no matter the effort, the hunger season, known as the lean months of late winter and early spring, was dreaded. Grain supplies dwindled, vegetables were scarce, and people often went hungry until the first harvests arrived. The quality of food varied not only by wealth, but also by law. Medieval towns enforced regulations on bread and ale, ensuring that bakers and brewers did not cheat their customers with adulterated goods. Yet enforcement was inconsistent, and desperate times led to desperate measures. Some bakers stretched flour with fillers like ground acorns or sawdust, producing loaves that were barely edible. Peasants, forced to accept what they could afford, endured meals that were coarse and sometimes harmful. Even ale, the drink of choice for most peasants, was not always reliable, because water was often unsafe to drink. Weak ale, sometimes called small beer, was consumed daily, even by children. It provided hydration and calories, though it was far less potent than modern beer. But ale could be watered down by dishonest sellers, leaving peasants with thin, sour brews that offered little comfort. And yet, despite its hardships, the peasant's table was more than just a place of hunger. It was also a center of community. Meals were shared, however meager, and the act of eating together gave strength and solidarity. On feast days, Christmas, Easter, or the harvest festival, tables were laden with whatever could be spared, and joy was found even in small abundance. A roast pig, a wheel of cheese, a jug of stronger ale. These were occasions that brightened the otherwise monotonous diet. As you drift towards sleep, picture again that rustic cottage. The fire crackles faintly, casting light on a family seated close together. Their bowls of porridge may be plain, their bread coarse and heavy, yet they eat with gratitude, for each meal was a victory over hunger. In the Middle Ages, food was not taken for granted. It was the result of hard labor in fields, of careful storage through the winter, of resilience in the face of scarcity. The peasant's table may not have offered variety or luxury, but it sustained life. And in its simplicity, it tells a story not just of deprivation but of endurance. It reminds us that the act of eating, however modest, was one of survival, of togetherness, and of hope. Now that we've seen the humble meals of the peasants, let us step into a very different world, the banquet halls of medieval lords and ladies. Imagine a stone castle, its walls hung with colorful tapestries to block the draught. Torches flicker in iron sconces, casting warm light across a great wooden table that stretches the length of the hall. At the head sits the lord, his family at his side, and before him a feast is laid out in dazzling abundance. To eat as the nobility did was to participate in a display of wealth, power, and prestige. A noble's table was not simply a place to satisfy hunger, it was a stage upon which rank and fortune were shown. Every dish, every spice, every performance of the servants was part of a carefully crafted spectacle, designed to impress guests and reinforce social order. Unlike peasants, who survived on grains and vegetables, nobles indulged in foods rich with meat, fish, and exotic flavors. Whole animals were roasted and carried into the hall, pigs with apples in their mouths, geese with crisp skin, and, on occasion, even swans or peacocks. These birds were not chosen for their taste so much as their grandeur. Sometimes, the feathers were removed before roasting, then carefully replaced after cooking, so the bird could be presented at table in its full, resplendent plumage. Imagine dining upon a peacock dressed in its own shimmering feathers, a showpiece more than a meal. The noble diet was far more varied than that of the peasantry, but it was not without problems. Meat was plentiful, but preservation was still difficult, even for the wealthy. Salt, honey, and smoke were used, yet spoilage remained a risk. Dishes were often heavily spiced, not, as myths suggest, to disguise rotten meat, but to show off wealth. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were imported from distant lands at great expense. A dish seasoned with cinnamon was a statement. The host had the means to purchase luxuries, carried across deserts and oceans. Banquets often unfolded in multiple courses, each designed to outdo the last. The first course might include roasted meats, pies, and fish dishes. The second would bring subtler flavors, perhaps stews, sausages, or stuffed pastries. The final course might present sweets, candied fruits, sugared almonds, or even molded sugar sculptures. Sugar, in particular, was a rare and costly ingredient, so its use was a dazzling signal of affluence. Dining etiquette among nobles was elaborate. Guests were seated according to rank, with the highest status individuals nearest the lord. Meals were served on trenchers of bread or wooden boards, shared between pairs of diners. Forks, though known in Europe, were slow to catch on. Instead, people ate with knives, spoons, and fingers. To eat with grace was as important as the food itself. Loud chewing, excessive drinking, or sloppy behavior could shame a guest, while refined manners elevated one's reputation. Servants played a vital role in the banquet theatre. Pages carried in dishes, carvers skillfully sliced roasts, and cupbearers poured wine or ale into goblets. Musicians played lutes or pipes, and jesters entertained with jokes and tricks. A feast was never only about eating. It was a full evening of performance, politics, and social exchange. For all their splendor, however, noble feasts were not necessarily healthy. The overabundance of meat, sugar, and rich sauces often led to ailments like gout, sometimes called the disease of kings. The diet was heavy, the portions immense, and moderation was rarely the goal. Nobles sought excess as proof of their superiority, while peasants outside the castle walls might have gone hungry. There were also darker sides to these spectacles. Feasts were occasions for reinforcing hierarchy, reminding everyone of their place. The lord and his honored guests enjoyed delicacies, while servants and lower-ranked attendees received simpler fare. In some cases, leftover trenchers, the thick bread used as plates, were given to the poor, a gesture of charity that also emphasized dependence. The symbolism of food extended even further. Certain dishes carried political or cultural weight. A boar's head, presented with an apple, was a traditional centerpiece in some feasts, representing strength and abundance. Spiced wines, known as hippocras, were often served at the close of meals, believed to aid digestion and signal the feast's conclusion. Even the act of carving a roast was imbued with meaning. Only skilled servers could perform the task, demonstrating discipline and refinement on behalf of their lord. Seasonal and religious calendars also shaped noble dining. During Lent and on fast days, meat was forbidden, and fish took center stage. Yet even here, the wealthy found ways to embellish. Fish pies, stuffed with elaborate fillings, graced tables, and sturgeon or salmon were highly prized. Nobles could afford the best catches, transported from distant waters, preserved in ice or salt. It is easy to imagine these banquets as merry, indulgent affairs, but beneath the spectacle lay an undercurrent of formality and duty. A feast was not thrown simply for pleasure, it was a political tool. Hosting visiting dignitaries with a lavish meal could secure alliances, cement loyalty, or intimidate rivals. In this way, food became a language of power, one understood by all who sat at the table. Picture again the great hall, the torches flickering, the long table groaning under the weight of roasted meats, pies, and sugared delicacies. Laughter mingles with music, yet behind the merriment lies calculation. Every dish is a message, every spice a symbol. The nobility dined not just for hunger, but to remind themselves, and others, that they stood above the rest of society. As you drift deeper into rest, let the image fade. The the clatter of knives, the murmur of conversation, the scent of roasted game and spiced wine. Tomorrow, the peasants will return to their porridge and bread. But tonight, in the castle hall, the nobility feast in splendor. Theirs was a world of excess, a theater of dining where food was both sustenance and stagecraft. Imagine for a moment the dull taste of barley bread and watery pottage, the staples of a peasant's table. Now picture the sharp heat of black pepper, the sweetness of cinnamon, or the fiery bite of ginger sprinkled across that same dish. In medieval Europe, such flavors were rare treasures, reserved almost exclusively for the wealthy. Spices were more than just ingredients. They were symbols of status, luxury, and connection to faraway worlds. To understand medieval dining, we must step beyond the castle kitchens and into the bustling networks of global trade. Spices, so common to us today, were once among the most coveted commodities in existence. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, and ginger traveled thousands of miles before reaching European tables. Their journey was long, perilous, and astonishingly expensive. The spice trade linked Europe to distant lands, the Malabar coast of India for pepper, the islands of Indonesia for nutmeg and cloves, Ceylon for cinnamon. These regions seemed unimaginably far to medieval Europeans, places of legend as much as reality. The spices themselves carried an aura of mystery. They were rumored to come from dragon-guarded groves or distant lands, reached only by heroic merchants. In truth, spices reached Europe through a complex chain of middlemen. Arab merchants dominated the trade for centuries, transporting goods along overland routes, such as the Silk Road, or across the Indian Ocean in sturdy dhows. From there, spices passed into the hands of Venetian and Genoese traders, who controlled their distribution within Europe. By the time pepper arrived in a London market, its price had multiplied many times over. The cost was staggering. In the 11th century, a pound of nutmeg could cost the equivalent of 7 fattened oxen. Pepper was measured out almost grain by grain, stored under lock and key. So precious were spices that they were sometimes used as currency or as part of dowries and inheritances. To gift someone a pouch of cloves was not simply an act of generosity. It was a display of wealth. Nobles flaunted their affluence by seasoning their dishes heavily. A stew laced with ginger or a sauce thick with cinnamon was as much about spectacle as taste. Guests could not fail to notice that such flavors came at great expense, imported from lands most would never see. In this way, spices became edible jewels, tokens of prestige as much as culinary delights. Beyond taste and status, spices also carried medicinal and symbolic value. Medieval medical theory, rooted in the teachings of Galen and humoral balance, held that food influenced health and temperament. Pepper was thought to stimulate digestion, cinnamon to warm the body, and nutmeg to ward off plague. Spices were incorporated into tonics, syrups, and even charms, believed to hold protective powers. A noble sprinkling nutmeg into his wine was not only savoring luxury, but also, in his mind, safeguarding health. The church, too, found uses for these costly imports. Incense derived from resins like frankincense and myrrh perfumed cathedrals and monasteries, elevating the senses during worship. Spices thus became entwined with both earthly pleasure and spiritual devotion, bridging the material and the divine. But the story of spices is also one of conflict and ambition. Control of the spice trade was a prize worth fighting for. Venice grew rich as the central hub of distribution, and rival powers envied its monopoly. The desire to bypass middlemen and establish direct access to the sources of pepper and cinnamon spurred European exploration. In many ways, the voyages of Columbus, da Gama, and Magellan were fueled not by dreams of discovery alone, but by hunger for spices. A dash of pepper on a noble's stew was the tip of an iceberg of global ambition. Yet, while the nobility reveled in these rare flavors, the common folk could only dream of them. At best, peasants had access to garlic, onions, mustard seeds, and herbs grown in small kitchen gardens. Their spices were pungent and local, a far cry from the exotic imports. The gap between peasant and noble dining was thus widened not only by the amount of food consumed, but also by the flavors that adorned it. Consider the tale of a medieval merchant returning home from a journey east. His chest is filled with small sacks of pepper, ginger, and cinnamon. The spices are carefully weighed, each portion destined for the tables of lords and bishops. Outside, in the market square, peasants hawk onions and leeks, their flavors sharp but familiar. The merchant's cargo might as well be gold to them, for it will never grace their porridge or bread. Even in times of scarcity, the nobility's access to spices was maintained. Chronicles tell of kings and queens demanding spice dishes during sieges, their cooks stretching dwindling supplies of cinnamon and cloves to maintain appearances. To lose one's spices was to lose face, a failure in the theater of power. As night falls on our imagined medieval world, picture again the long journey of a single peppercorns, harvested in a distant land, packed onto a ship crossing treacherous seas, traded hand to hand through ports and markets, finally placed into a gilded spice jar in a European castle. From there, it is sprinkled across a steaming roast, its sharp taste cutting through the heavy meat. A small thing, perhaps, but behind it lies a network of global connections, ambition, and greed. And so, dear listener, as you drift further toward rest, remember that the flavors we take for granted today, pepper on your eggs, cinnamon in your tea, nutmeg on a dessert, were once luxuries beyond the reach of most. They shaped empires, drove exploration, and changed the course of history. The spice trade was not just about taste, it was about the hunger of nations. Close your eyes, if you wish, and let the scent of distant spices linger in your imagination. A whisper of cinnamon, the warmth of ginger, the tickle of pepper on the tongue. Let them fade into dreams, where caravans cross deserts and ships sail stormy seas, carrying treasures that once defined the medieval world. Food in the Middle Ages was not only about what one could grow, hunt, or buy. It was equally about how long it could last. Without refrigeration, preservation was a daily challenge. Every meal carried the quiet question, would the food keep? Or would it spoil before it could be eaten? The struggle to store food safely shaped not just medieval diets, but entire rhythms of life. Imagine a modest peasant cottage. In one corner, a sack of barley rests against the wall. Beside it hangs a side of pork, salted and darkened with age. The air is tinged with smoke from the hearth, the same smoke that drifts upward into rafters, where strips of meat hang to dry. Preservation was rarely elegant, but it was essential. Salt was the great preserver of the medieval world. Vast amounts were needed to cure meat and fish, to draw out moisture, and to slow decay. Coastal towns often grew wealthy from the salt trade, for without it, survival through winter was precarious. A herring, heavily salted and packed into barrels, could be transported across countries, feeding villages far from the sea. Salted cod, known as stockfish, became a staple for much of Europe. Its leathery texture was softened only after hours of soaking and boiling, but it kept bellies full long after fresh catches had rotted away. Smoking was another common method. Strips of pork or beef were hung above a slow fire, the smoke not only drying the meat but adding flavor. In rural cottages, rafters darkened over the years with soot, a permanent reminder of countless meals preserved overhead. For peasants, Smoked bacon or ham might be the only meat eaten for months. For nobles, smoking was less about necessity and more about variety. Another way to present a dish with distinctive taste. Drying and salting extended beyond meat. Fruits like apples, pears, and plums were sliced thin and set in the sun or near a hearth, then stored in linen sacks. Vegetables such as beans and peas were dried in bulk, ready to be rehydrated into pottages during the lean winter months. Even bread, when hard and stale, could be crumbled into soups or softened with ale, ensuring that little went to waste. Fermentation provided yet another tool. Cabbage became sauerkraut, lasting long after fresh leaves had wilted. Milk turned into cheese, each wheel carefully aged in cool, dark cellars. Ale, brewed regularly in households and monasteries, was less a luxury than a necessity, since brewing transformed unsafe water into something drinkable. Through fermentation, the fleeting became durable, and the perishable gained new life. Pickling also made its mark on medieval tables. Onions, cucumbers, and even fish could be steeped in vinegar, their sharp tang adding both flavor and longevity. Vinegar itself was often a by-product of wine gone sour, ensuring nothing was wasted. A jug of pickled vegetables might brighten an otherwise bland meal of grains, offering both taste and nourishment when fresh produce was scarce. Storage was as important as the preservation itself. In wealthy households, pantries and larders were designed to keep food cool and dry. Stone walls, thick doors, and sometimes even ice brought from frozen rivers allowed nobles to maintain supplies longer than peasants could dream of. In castles, whole cellars were devoted to barrels of salted fish, casks of ale, and sacks of grain. These storerooms were lifelines during sieges, when outside supplies were cut off and the inhabitants had to survive on what was kept within. Peasant homes, by contrast, had little in the way of storage. A sack of grain might be kept in the corner, vulnerable to dampness or rodents. Meat hung from beams, exposed to smoke and insects alike. Winter often meant scraping the bottom of the barrel, literally. Hunger sharpened as supplies dwindled, and families were forced to stretch what little remained. Even nobles, despite their abundance, faced the risks of spoilage. Without understanding of bacteria or mold, food could still go bad, and preservation methods were imperfect. A salted fish might carry hidden rot, a cask of oil might sour unexpectedly, a wheel of cheese might collapse into foul-smelling decay. To eat was always to gamble, no matter one's station. Preserved foods shaped medieval taste. Salted meats were chewy, dried beans tough, smoked bacon heavy with soot. These were not the fresh, bright flavors we enjoy today, but dense, laborious foods that filled stomachs without necessarily delighting palates. Over time, people grew accustomed to such fare. A meal of pickled cabbage and salted fish, though harsh by modern standards, was familiar comfort to those who had little else. There were also cultural and religious layers to preservation. The church mandated fast days and long periods such as Lent, when meat was forbidden. In these times, salted fish became indispensable, its availability ensuring the faithful could observe dietary restrictions. In monasteries, monks became masters of storage and preservation, their skill ensuring steady supplies for both their own tables and charitable offerings. The consequences of poor preservation could be dire. Spoiled food led to sickness, outbreaks of food poisoning, sweeping through households and even noble courts. Chronicles record kings and lords struck down after consuming tainted dishes, proof that no amount of wealth could entirely shield one from decay. Think, too, of the labor required. Salting demanded enormous amounts of expensive salt. Smoking meant tending fires constantly. Drying fruits or beans required careful timing to prevent mold. Fermenting and pickling demanded steady attention to vessels and jars. Preservation was not passive but active, a constant cycle of vigilance and effort. As you let your thoughts drift, picture again the medieval pantry. Barrels of salted fish stacked against stone walls. Ropes of onions hanging from beams. Wheels of cheese slowly aging in the cool dark. The air thick with the scent of smoke, vinegar, and earth. This was survival. An art of stretching today's harvest into tomorrow's meal. And yet, in this unromantic work of preserving and storing, we glimpse resilience. Against hunger, against the long winters, against the ever-present shadow of spoilage, people found ways to endure. Each barrel, each jar, each wheel of cheese was a small triumph, a quiet answer to the question of whether food would last until spring. So, as you drift deeper into rest, let the image of salted fish and pickled cabbage fade. In the silence of a medieval storeroom, where food waited in the dark, generations found the means to carry on. Their ingenuity, born of necessity, shaped the very taste of their world. Not every meal in the Middle Ages was what it seemed. Hunger and hardship pushed many food sellers to stretch their supplies, and profit sometimes outweighed honesty. For peasants and townsfolk alike, the bread they bought or the ale they drank might be far from pure. To eat and drink was to trust strangers, and that trust was often broken. Bread was the foundation of medieval diets, but even this staple could not be relied upon. Bakers, especially in crowded cities, were known to add fillers to their dough. Ground acorns, bean flour, and sometimes even chalk or sawdust found their way into loaves. These additions made bread heavier, grittier, and far less nutritious. But they also allowed scarce wheat to stretch further. A family might buy what they thought was wholesome bread, only to find it hard, dry, and nearly inedible. For peasants, bread adulteration was more than an inconvenience. It could be dangerous. Acorns not properly treated could cause illness. Chalk and sawdust offered no nourishment and wore down teeth. A food meant to sustain could instead weaken. Imagine the frustration of spending precious coins on bread that left the stomach no fuller than before. Ale, too, was often tampered with. Brewing was a common trade for women, known as alewives, who made small batches for local sale. While many brewed honestly, others diluted their ale with water or stretched ingredients to increase profits. The result was a thin, sour liquid that barely resembled the hearty ale people expected. In times when clean water was scarce, weak ale was still safer to drink than a stream or well. But it offered little comfort to those who longed for something stronger. Wine, favored in southern Europe and among the wealthy, was not immune either. Merchants might water it down or mix in substances to enhance color and flavor. Some added honey or spices to mask poor quality. Others used more questionable means, slipping in chalk or lead salts to improve appearance. Such practices could be harmful, even deadly, though knowledge of the risks was limited. These acts of deception became so common that authorities attempted to intervene. In 1267, the English, assize of bread and ale, set regulations on the price, weight, and quality of these essentials. Bakers and brewers who cheated customers could face fines, public humiliation, or even time in the pillory. Yet enforcement was uneven. Markets were busy, officials few, and the temptation to cheat remained strong. Consider the scene of a medieval marketplace. Stalls crowded with buyers, the smell of fish, meat, and fresh bread filling the air. A baker arranges loaves, each one smaller or denser than it should be. A brewer ladles out ale from a barrel, its surface thin and foamy. Customers bargain, hoping for fair measure, but few can know what corners were cut before the food reached their hands. Even meat was not free of trickery. Butchers might sell cuts from diseased animals or disguise old flesh with heavy salting or spices. Fishmongers sometimes presented stale fish as fresh, relying on strong smells of brine to mask decay. Buyers had little choice but to trust their senses, sniffing and tasting before committing to a purchase. Mistakes could lead to illness. For the wealthy, risk still lingered. A noble feast might feature meats preserved too long, or wines altered by unscrupulous suppliers. Even kings were not safe. Chronicles tell of monarchs struck ill after overeating fruits or drinking spoiled cider. In an age without scientific understanding of bacteria or toxins, foodborne illness was a constant shadow at the table. Adulteration was not always born of greed alone. For many small sellers, it was survival. A widow brewing ale might water it down because she could not afford enough malt. A baker might stretch flour with beans because the harvest was poor. These acts blurred the line between fraud and necessity, between dishonesty and desperation. To the ordinary consumer, though, the result was the same: food that failed to nourish, drink that failed to satisfy. The frustration was not only physical but emotional. Bread was meant to sustain, ale to comfort, wine to gladden the heart. When these turned false, they deepened the weariness of daily life. The church and community sometimes sought to protect the vulnerable. Parish priests might denounce dishonest bakers from the pulpit. Neighbors might boycott a brewer known for watery ale. Guilds attempted to uphold standards among their members, though not always successfully. Still, the struggle continued. For the temptation to cheat was ever present in a world where hunger pressed hard. Picture, if you will, an alewife stirring her brew late at night. The fire flickers, her children sleep nearby, and she hesitates before adding another bucket of water to the cauldron. She knows it will weaken the ale, but she also knows it will make the batch stretch further, enough to feed her family one more day. Such choices were not simple, and behind every mug of weak ale lay a story of survival. In cities, the consequences of adulteration were magnified. Crowds meant demand was high, and bad food could spread illness quickly. Outbreaks of dysentery or poisoning were often traced back to markets and taverns. Trust was fragile, yet people had little alternative. To eat was to risk, to drink was to gamble, and every purchase carried uncertainty. As you drift now, let that thought settle. Bread with hidden chalk, all thinned with water, wine colored with strange powders. Meals that should have brought comfort instead carried suspicion. Yet people endured, adapting, surviving, finding what nourishment they could. In the quiet of history, we see both deception and resilience. The baker with sawdust in his dough, the brewer with watered ale, the customer who bought despite knowing. All played their part in a world where food was precious, and nothing could be taken for granted. So rest now, with the soft hum of a medieval marketplace fading into silence. Stalls empty, barrels drained, loaves gone. Tomorrow, the struggle for honest food will begin again. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a small, thatched cottage in the middle of a medieval village. Smoke curls from the chimney, carrying the scent of a thin stew over the frost-bitten fields. Inside, a family huddles around a crackling fire, seeking warmth and a fleeting sense of comfort. The floor is covered in straw, meant to soften the hard earth beneath. And in one corner a pig roots through the bedding, its snorts punctuating the quiet evening. This was the reality for countless peasants. A life lived in close quarters with their animals. Animals were often kept inside for warmth, for protection, or simply because there was no separate barn. Their waste mingled with the straw and with the family's living space. Fleas and lice thrived in these conditions, hopping between the animals and the humans, carrying disease wherever they went. A simple scratch or bite could lead to a sickness that might linger for weeks. For a peasant, the lines between home, barn, and latrine were dangerously blurred. Even in the grandest castles, sanitation was a challenge. Latrines were often nothing more than wooden seats over pits, emptied only occasionally. Waste might seep into the soil, contaminating nearby wells. In towns and cities, the situation was far worse. Narrow, winding streets were clogged with garbage, human excrement, and the refuse of daily life. The air was thick with odors of decay and smoke, and vermin thrived in the shadows. Rats scuttled freely through markets and homes, spreading fleas that carried deadly diseases. It is little wonder that foodborne illness and epidemics were common. The very act of eating could be hazardous. Fruits and vegetables washed in contaminated water, meat stored in unsanitary conditions, and fish left to rot in the sun, all could make a person violently ill. Even the wealthy were not immune. Chroniclers tell of kings and queens struck down by spoiled fruit, tainted wine, or overindulgence in rich feasts. King John of England, for example, is believed to have succumbed to dysentery after consuming spoiled peaches and new cider. The Black Death, which decimated Europe in the 14th century, was partially facilitated by these unsanitary conditions. Fleas carried by rats spread the plague from town to town, killing 1/3 of the continent's population. The poor, living in crowded, filthy conditions, suffered the most. Their weakened bodies, malnourished and burdened by daily toil, offered little resistance to the microscopic horrors that lurked unseen. Water, the simplest necessity of life, was often the most dangerous. Rivers, wells, and cisterns could easily become contaminated by runoff from latrines or the slaughter of animals. People had little understanding of germs or bacteria, yet they knew the results of consuming polluted water. Dysentery, typhoid, and cholera were ever-present threats, and the sick often had no hope of treatment. To drink and to survive was a delicate gamble. Markets, too, were fraught with danger. Fresh meat and fish sat exposed to flies and vermin, while grains and vegetables were stored in barns that offered little protection from pests. Customers had to rely on their senses, smell, sight, touch, to judge whether a product was safe. Sometimes this worked, sometimes it failed, with consequences that could be deadly. Children often assisted in these tasks, their small hands learning early the fine line between nourishment and poison. Despite the grim conditions, people adapted. They developed practical methods to reduce risk, even without modern knowledge. Herbs such as thyme, sage, and rosemary were believed to purify food and water. Vinegar and oil were used for cooking, as their acidity could kill some bacteria. Smoking, salting, and pickling extended the life of meat and fish, making it safer to consume over time. These techniques, though rudimentary, were lifelines in a world teeming with unseen threats. Monasteries and abbeys often offered a sanctuary of hygiene relative to the surrounding towns. Monks and nuns tended gardens, raised animals, and prepared food in ways that minimized contamination. These religious communities served as centers of learning, not only in theology, but also in the practical arts of preservation and cleanliness. Pilgrims or the poor could sometimes find relief within these walls, receiving food that had been prepared with care and forethought. Yet the broader population lived in perpetual tension with the unsanitary conditions around them. Every meal, every sip of water, carried the risk of disease. Children grew up with the constant presence of insects and vermin. Adults carried the burden of survival, balancing the need for nutrition against the invisible threats that surrounded them. Even simple gestures, like washing hands or boiling water, were not common knowledge. Each day was a careful negotiation with the hazards of daily life. Through it all, there were glimmers of hope and resilience. Communities often came together to clean streets or repair wells. Knowledge passed orally from one generation to the next taught which water sources were safest or which foods to avoid. Faith offered spiritual solace and a framework for understanding suffering. For medieval peasants, sanitation was not merely a matter of comfort. It was entwined with survival, belief, and community. As you drift deeper into slumber, imagine the quiet courage it took to navigate these dangers daily. Picture the family sharing a thin pottage, the children brushing off fleas, the neighbors helping one another through illness. Each act of endurance was a triumph over adversity, however small. The hardships of unsanitary living shaped not only physical survival, but the rhythms of medieval life, the customs, and even the culinary choices of the era. In the next chapter, we will explore how the Church, despite its strict rules and demands, played a role in alleviating hunger and offering hope to the destitute. From almsgiving to the careful preparation of charitable meals, the religious institutions of the Middle Ages were both spiritual guides and practical providers in a world dominated by scarcity and filth. Imagine the sound of church bells tolling over the quiet fields of medieval Europe. Their deep, resonant tones echo across villages and towns, marking not just the hours of prayer, but also the rhythm of daily life. For peasants, the bells were a signal of structure in an otherwise unpredictable world. They called farmers to work, merchants to open their stalls, and families to pause for a moment of spiritual reflection. The Church was the beating heart of society, its influence extending far beyond matters of faith. In a time when life was harsh and unpredictable, the Church offered a measure of stability. Its presence dictated schedules, celebrations, and even dietary restrictions. Mateless days and fasting periods were strictly observed, particularly during Lent, Advent, and other religious seasons. These requirements, while spiritually motivated, placed an additional burden on a population already struggling to secure enough food. A peasant family, subsisting primarily on grains, legumes, and the occasional piece of meat or fish, had to navigate these fasting mandates carefully. Yet, in the minds of the faithful, such sacrifices were believed to bring spiritual reward, a debt paid to God in patience and endurance. The Church was also a source of charity and relief, though not without its complexities. Monasteries and abbeys maintained gardens, orchards, and livestock to provide for their own communities and for those who sought help. Alms were distributed to the poor, particularly during religious festivals or times of famine. These meals, though modest, could mean the difference between life and death for those on the brink of starvation. Monks and nuns carefully prepared these provisions, often incorporating grains, legumes, and whatever vegetables were in season. Bread was a staple of these charitable offerings, a humble yet sustaining gift. Religious institutions also acted as centers of education, passing down culinary knowledge alongside spiritual teachings. Monastic kitchens were often well organized, employing techniques that minimized waste and maximized nutrition within the limitations of the time. Preservation methods such as pickling, salting, and drying were commonly used to extend the life of vegetables, fruits, and meats. Some monasteries even produced their own cheese, butter, and ale, providing relatively reliable sources of sustenance. In this way, the Church not only nurtured souls, but also offered practical solutions for survival in a challenging environment. Yet the Church's influence was not limited to charity and education. It shaped social norms and expectations around food consumption. Feasting and fasting were intertwined with moral and spiritual life. The upper classes often timed their banquets to coincide with religious festivals, blending piety with displays of wealth and power. Conversely, peasants measured their meals carefully to comply with both scarcity and the dictates of faith. The Church's emphasis on moderation, humility, and self-restraint permeated every aspect of daily sustenance, teaching lessons that were spiritual as much as they were practical. Pilgrimages, another important facet of medieval religious life, brought people into contact with different foods and culinary practices. Pilgrims traveling to shrines or holy sites would encounter a variety of local dishes, preserved foods, and travel rations. While the journey was often exhausting and dangerous, it also offered exposure to new grains, spices, and preparation techniques. Pilgrimage could broaden the palate in unexpected ways, even if the average pilgrim's diet remained simple and repetitive. The Church's vast network of hostels, monasteries, and hospices ensured that travelers could find rest and nourishment, further reinforcing its role as both spiritual guide and practical caretaker. The Church's dietary regulations also indirectly influenced agricultural practices. Livestock management, crop rotation, and seasonal planting were all tied to religious calendars and the demand for specific foods at particular times of the year. For instance, the need to produce fish for fast days encouraged the maintenance of private ponds and the expansion of aquaculture. Monks became experts in these practices, contributing to the overall efficiency and sustainability of medieval food systems. In this way, the spiritual demands of the Church had tangible effects on what people ate and how they grew it. It is important to remember that the Church's influence extended even into the domestic sphere. Housewives and household managers carefully observed fasting rules, planning meals to ensure compliance while still feeding the family adequately. Recipes, though rudimentary by modern standards, were often preserved in monastic manuscripts, teaching generations how to prepare nourishing food within the constraints of religious observance. Herbs, fermented products, and preserved foods were incorporated to enhance flavor and sustain nutrition, all while adhering to the moral and spiritual framework imposed by the Church. Despite the rigidity of rules and the hardships imposed by fasting, the Church could also be a source of comfort and joy. Religious feasts and celebrations were times of communal gathering, storytelling, and, yes, indulgence. The preparation of shared meals created a sense of unity, reinforcing community bonds and providing a temporary respite from the hardships of everyday life. Even the poorest peasants could partake in these moments, savoring small joys in a world often dominated by toil and scarcity. In reflecting on the Church's influence, it becomes clear that its role in medieval food culture was multifaceted. It was at once restrictive and generous, moralizing and practical. The Church dictated what could be eaten, when it could be eaten, and in what quantity. Yet it also provided sanctuary, knowledge, and sustenance to those in need. Its reach was vast, shaping the rhythms of daily life, the structures of society, and the very way people experienced food. As you let your mind drift further into this medieval landscape, picture the bells tolling in the distance, signaling not only prayer, but also the promise of nourishment. Imagine a monk distributing bread to a line of weary villagers, or a family carefully planning a meatless meal in observance of Lent. In these moments, the influence of the Church becomes tangible, touching every corner of life, from the grand halls of monasteries to the humble cottages of the peasantry. In our next chapter, we will explore the striking contrast between the austere diet of peasants and the lavish banquets of the nobility. We'll wander into the great halls, where spiced meats, sweet pastries, and exotic ingredients create a world far removed from the meager fare of the average medieval household. This contrast reveals not only social inequality, but also the ingenuity, extravagance, and cultural values of the time. As the church bells fade into the distance, let us now turn our gaze from the humble cottages of peasants to the grand halls of the medieval nobility. Picture a sprawling stone castle perched atop a hill, its towering walls and turrets visible for miles. Inside, the main hall is alive with activity. Torches flicker along stone walls. The clatter of silverware echoes on long wooden tables, and the scent of roasting meat mingles with the aromas of spiced sauces and freshly baked bread. Here, food is not merely sustenance. It is a spectacle, a marker of wealth, power, and prestige. A noble banquet is an event that engages all the senses. Guests arrive in elaborate attire, their fabrics gleaming with vibrant colors, embroidery, and furs. The room is decorated with tapestries depicting scenes of chivalry, hunting, or biblical stories, offering both aesthetic pleasure and conversation starters. Musicians play lutes, harps, and flutes in the background, providing a melodic backdrop to the forthcoming feast. Servants scurry across the hall, balancing platters laden with food that seems almost too extravagant to eat. It is a world apart from the meager fare of peasants, a vivid demonstration of hierarchy and abundance. The centerpiece of any noble feast is, of course, the meat. Large joints of beef, mutton, and pork are roasted over open flames, their fat sizzling and crackling, filling the hall with a savory aroma that makes mouths water. Game birds, peacocks, swans, pheasants, and partridges are often served whole, sometimes adorned with their feathers for a dramatic presentation. Hunted deer or wild boar might appear on a specially constructed spit, offering both sustenance and spectacle. The preparation of these dishes requires skilled cooks, often trained in the art of roasting, braising, and seasoning with rare and expensive spices that would be unattainable for common folk. Spices are a vital part of noble cuisine, and they are used with abandon. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, saffron, and cloves transform simple ingredients into opulent dishes, reflecting both status and connections to far-off trade networks. A pound of nutmeg could cost more than a laborer's yearly wage. Yet here it is, liberally sprinkled over roasted meats and stewed fruits. These flavors are not just enjoyed. They are displayed as symbols of wealth, signaling that the host can afford the luxuries of the wider world. Honey, sugar, and preserved fruits add sweetness to the feast, highlighting the skill of bakers and confectioners who crafted intricate tarts, pies, and pastries. Banquets are not limited to meat and sweet delicacies. A variety of breads, cheeses, and pottages accompany the main courses, ensuring that the table is overflowing with options. Bread may come in different grades, from fine white loaves to coarser rye and barley versions, each serving a purpose in the visual and gustatory display. Cheeses, often produced in monastic dairies, are presented alongside pickled vegetables and fruits, providing contrast and complexity to the meal. The overall effect is one of abundance and diversity, an orchestration of flavors, textures, and colors designed to impress and delight. Drinks play an equally important role in noble dining. Wine, often imported from France, Spain, or Italy, flows freely, sometimes mixed with spices or honey to create mulled wine. Ale and mead are also present, though wine is the preferred drink for the upper classes. Goblets of silver or gold are passed around, their contents enjoyed slowly, allowing conversation, negotiation, and socializing to unfold. Toasts are made, praises offered to the host, and agreements forged, all facilitated by the convivial atmosphere of the banquet table. The structure of a noble feast is formalized. with multiple courses presented in succession. A typical meal might begin with soups or broths, followed by roasted meats, pies, and pasties, and concluded with desserts of sweetmeats, tarts, and candied fruits. Exotic ingredients such as almonds, saffron, or dates are woven into recipes, demonstrating both refinement and access to far-reaching trade networks. The pace of the meal allows guests to appreciate each dish while engaging in conversation, games, and entertainment, making the feast a central social and political event. Entertainment is a vital component of these gatherings. Jugglers, minstrels, and acrobats perform between courses, providing amusement and spectacle. Sometimes, hunting or falconry demonstrations are arranged in the castle grounds, linking the outdoor pursuits of the nobility with the lavishness of indoor dining. Storytelling, poetry, and song add layers of cultural richness to the feast, reinforcing the idea that the noble table is as much about education, diplomacy, and display as it is about sustenance. Yet, even amidst such grandeur, the risks of medieval dining remain present. Food spoilage and contamination could affect nobles as easily as peasants. Wealthy households employed large kitchens, with specialized staff to minimize these dangers. But incidents of food poisoning were not uncommon. The sheer volume of food consumed, combined with limited understanding of hygiene, sometimes led to illness, highlighting that even privilege could not completely insulate against the challenges of medieval food culture. In considering noble feasts, it is impossible not to reflect on the stark contrast between the lives of peasants and the nobility. While common folk subsisted on porridge, bread, and occasional meat, the upper classes indulged in a sensory extravaganza, demonstrating power and refinement at every turn. The abundance of the noble table was a visual and gustatory assertion of social hierarchy, a reminder of who controlled resources and who labored to sustain them. And yet, these feasts also illustrate human ingenuity and adaptability. Cooks, bakers, and servants navigated complex recipes, mastered preservation techniques, and orchestrated elaborate presentations. The noble banquet, in all its splendor, was a testament to the creativity and skill required to transform raw ingredients into art, nourishment, and social theater. As we let our minds linger in the glow of candlelit halls, imagine the clatter of plates, the aroma of roasting meats, the chatter of noble guests, and the distant tolling of the church bells. In this world of opulence and ritual, food was more than mere sustenance. It was a language, a symbol, and a spectacle. In our next chapter, we will explore the culinary practices of travelers and pilgrims, whose diets, though humble, reveal resilience, resourcefulness, and a connection between distant regions and cultures. Their meals remind us that food is not only a matter of wealth, but also of necessity, ingenuity, and adaptation. As we leave the stone halls of the nobility behind, let us follow the path of those who journeyed through medieval Europe: travelers, merchants, and pilgrims. Their meals were a stark contrast to the lavish feasts of kings and lords, yet they reveal much about resourcefulness, endurance, and the human need to sustain oneself on the road. Picture a dirt track stretching through rolling hills, with a group of weary pilgrims making their way toward a distant shrine. Their belongings are few, carried in small packs or on the backs of donkeys, and every bite of food is precious. Travel in the Middle Ages was arduous, slow, and fraught with challenges. Roads were little more than dirt paths, often muddied by rain or obstructed by fallen trees. Bridges were scarce, and rivers had to be forded or circumvented. Inns existed, but they were few and far between, and accommodations were basic at best. Travelers often carried their own provisions, which dictated what and how they could eat. Hard breads, salted meat, dried legumes, and cheese were staples, chosen for their durability and ease of transport. These items could last for days or even weeks without spoiling, though their flavor was far from appealing. Bread was a constant companion, a dense, coarse loaf, sometimes made from rye or barley, served as both food and utensil. Slices were often soaked in broth or water to make them more palatable, creating a simple porridge, like meal that could be eaten without cooking. Hardtack, a type of dry biscuit, was particularly common among long-distance travelers and soldiers. Its texture was famously tough, requiring soaking in liquid to soften. Yet its longevity made it indispensable for survival on the road. Salted or dried meats were another critical provision. Pork, beef, and fish were preserved through salting or smoking, ensuring they could withstand long journeys without refrigeration. These meats provided vital protein, though the high salt content and toughness made them a challenging meal. Sometimes, travelers would supplement their diet with foraged herbs, wild berries, or nuts, adding a fleeting touch of freshness to otherwise monotonous fare. Cheese, particularly hard, aged varieties, was favored for its longevity. Aged cheeses could last weeks without refrigeration, providing a dense, fatty source of calories. Paired with bread, it formed a basic yet sustaining meal. Butter and milk, on the other hand, were rare luxuries for travelers, as they spoiled quickly without careful storage. Similarly, fruits and vegetables were limited to seasonal availability or preserved forms such as dried apples, pears, or legumes. Pilgrims, driven by religious devotion, often had additional restrictions imposed by faith. Fasting days, abstaining from meat, or adhering to specific dietary rules could complicate their meals. A pilgrim walking to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or Canterbury in England, might subsist on nothing more than bread, cheese, and a few beans for days, relying on the hospitality of monasteries, inns, or local villagers. Monasteries frequently offered simple meals to travelers, providing porridge, bread, and occasionally a small portion of meat or fish. These acts of charity were vital lifelines, sustaining pilgrims who had limited means and long distances to cover. Drinking water was another challenge for travelers. Rivers and streams were often contaminated, and wells were not always accessible. For safety, many relied on weak ale or watered wine, which, though thin and unpalatable compared to noble beverages, was far safer than untreated water. Boiling water was an option for those with pots and fire, but fuel was often scarce on long journeys, making ale and wine the practical choice. Travelers and pilgrims also developed clever methods to stretch their provisions. Pottage, a simple stew of grains, legumes, and any available vegetables or meat, was a common solution. Ingredients were combined in a single pot over an open fire, creating a nourishing meal that could feed many with minimal resources. Salted meat or fish was added when available, while herbs gathered along the roadside lent flavor and aroma. Pottage was eaten with bread or hard biscuits, and the shared act of cooking and eating often fostered camaraderie among travelers. Markets, fairs, and roadside vendors provided occasional relief from the monotony of carried provisions. Fresh bread, cheese, fruits, and occasionally roasted meats could be purchased, though affordability and availability were always concerns. Pilgrims often pooled resources to buy food in bulk, sharing what little they could with companions to ensure that everyone could continue their journey. Despite the hardships, the food of travelers was intimately connected to the landscape and seasons. Wild herbs, mushrooms, berries, and even edible roots provided vital supplements to their diet. Foraging required knowledge of local flora and its safe consumption, skills that were passed down through generations. Travelers became adept at reading the land for sustenance, a skill essential for survival in a time before modern convenience stores and global supply chains. Meals on the road were also communal experiences. Sharing bread, stew, or salted meat fostered bonds among travelers. Stories were exchanged, prayers offered, and advice given, all while huddled around a fire or resting under the shelter of an inn's roof. Food was a necessity, yes, but also a social glue, connecting people across regions and classes who might otherwise never meet. As we leave the winding dirt paths behind and imagine the flickering flames of a roadside fire, it becomes clear that the food of travelers and pilgrims was a testament to resilience. Simple, often bland, and occasionally barely edible, it nonetheless provided the energy, sustenance, and sense of community necessary for enduring long and challenging journeys. Unlike the noble's feast, which dazzled and displayed power, the traveler's meal nourished, protected, and connected. In our next chapter, we will journey further into medieval culture, exploring the fascinating world of festivals and fairs. These gatherings were moments of temporary abundance and indulgence, offering glimpses of food, music, and merriment that bridged the gap between the daily struggles of peasants and the extravagance of nobility. As the long, harsh months of labor and scarcity stretched on, the medieval calendar offered a few treasured breaks: festivals, fairs, and holy days. These moments were marked by temporary abundance, communal celebration, and indulgence, offering the average peasant and townsfolk a taste, sometimes literally, of food and drink that was otherwise rare or unattainable. Picture a village green bursting with color, the air filled with the scent of roasting meats, freshly baked pies, and the sharp tang of spiced wine. For a brief time, hunger could be forgotten, replaced by music, dance, and the shared joy of communal feasting. Festivals were often tied to the liturgical calendar. Christmas, Easter, and the feast days of saints provided opportunities for families to enjoy richer meals than those of everyday life. Meat, forbidden on ordinary fast days, could be consumed with enthusiasm. Pies filled with beef, pork, or game might be prepared, alongside sweetmeats and confections for the lucky few. Ale and wine flowed more freely, giving adults a sense of warmth and cheer. Even for peasants, who worked relentlessly in the fields, these days were occasions for both spiritual and sensory delight. Village fairs, held seasonally or in conjunction with religious festivals, were the highlights of rural life. Merchants, traveling from town to town, set up stalls offering a variety of foods: dried fruits, nuts, cheeses, pastries, and, for those with enough coin, roasted meats. The scent of roasting pigs or fowl wafted through the crowds, mingling with the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakery. These gatherings were not only opportunities to purchase delicacies, but also occasions for socialization, storytelling, and trade. Children chased one another across the muddy fields, while adults bartered goods or exchanged news from distant villages. Seasonality dictated much of what could be enjoyed at fairs. Spring and summer offered fresh fruits and vegetables: apples, cherries, plums, cabbages, and beans. Autumn brought root vegetables, late fruits, and the first harvest grains, while winter relied on preserved foods: salted meats, pickled vegetables, and dried fruits. Festivals thus became symbolic, celebrating not only religious or civic occasions, but also the natural rhythm of the agricultural year. Foods served were reflections of this cycle, highlighting the ingenuity and adaptability of medieval cooks. Sweet treats, though rare and expensive, played a prominent role in festival cuisine. Honey was the primary sweetener, as sugar was a precious import from distant lands. Honey cakes, tarts, and small confections could be enjoyed by those fortunate enough to afford them. For peasants, the occasional honeyed pastry or spiced cake was a true indulgence, a stark contrast to the daily diet of porridge and coarse bread. Nobility, however, indulged in extravagant desserts, combining honey, imported sugar, dried fruits, and exotic spices to create elaborate sweet dishes that dazzled both the eye and palate. Drinks also reflected the festive spirit. Ale, wine, and mead were consumed with abandon, often flavored with herbs and spices. Mulled wine, infused with cinnamon, cloves, and ginger, became a seasonal favorite, warming both body and soul in the cold months. Even those who drank sparingly during the regular year allowed themselves greater liberty during celebrations. Communal drinking vessels, shared among family or community members, reinforced social bonds while sustaining the festive mood. Yet, despite the occasional abundance, festivals were not without risk. Food safety remained precarious, and overindulgence could lead to illness. Spoiled meat or improperly stored dairy products could turn celebrations into hazards. Moreover, excessive drinking sometimes fueled quarrels, accidents, or even violence in crowded spaces. Nonetheless, these dangers were secondary to the joy and relief that temporary feasts brought to communities accustomed to scarcity. The preparation for festivals and fairs was itself an event, drawing families and neighbors together. Cooks and bakers would spend hours kneading dough, roasting meats, and preparing spiced dishes. Communities often pooled resources to create larger, more extravagant meals than any one household could manage alone. Recipes were passed down orally, with techniques honed over generations. In monasteries, kitchens prepared feasts not only for the monks, but also for visiting pilgrims or the local poor, reinforcing both charity and community cohesion. Markets and fairs also allowed for the exchange of exotic foods that would otherwise be unattainable. Traders brought spices, dried fruits, and imported delicacies from far-off lands. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper could transform a humble dish into a flavorful marvel, offering a taste of the wider world, though still expensive and reserved primarily for the wealthy. These rare ingredients became aspirational symbols, glimpses of the culinary sophistication enjoyed by those with means. The social aspect of festival eating cannot be overstated. Sitting together around a long table, sharing food and conversation, reinforced the fabric of medieval communities. Children learned the rituals of the table, apprentices observed the skills of cooks, and neighbors forged bonds over shared bread and roasted meats. Food was more than sustenance, it was a tool for teaching, for bonding, and for sustaining morale in a world where daily survival was a struggle. Even in urban centers, festival fairs brought similar excitement. Town squares transformed into bustling marketplaces, filled with vendors selling delicacies, roasted meats on spits, pies and pastries, and spiced drinks. Traveling entertainers, musicians, and storytellers added to the sensory experience, making food an inseparable part of cultural celebration. The mingling of sounds, smells, and sights created a multisensory feast that complemented the simple pleasure of eating and drinking. As we leave the lively scenes of fairs and festivals behind, we are reminded that food in medieval times was deeply tied to culture, season, and community. Even the humblest peasant could experience moments of joy and indulgence, temporarily escaping the monotony of daily fare. Festivals and fairs provided not only nourishment for the body, but also for the spirit, a reminder that human resilience is often celebrated with shared meals and communal cheer. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention to the kitchens of the wealthy, the castles and manor houses, where chefs labored to produce extravagant dishes, blending skill, artistry, and the rarest ingredients to create feasts that dazzled both the eye and the palate. These kitchens reveal the stark contrasts between noble and peasant life, and the lengths to which the powerful went to display wealth through food. As we leave behind the bustling village fairs and modest peasant meals, let us step into a world of grandeur, opulence, and culinary ambition, the kitchens of the nobility. Picture a great stone castle rising from a hilltop, its walls echoing with the clang of swords and the murmurs of courtiers. Deep within its chambers, a team of cooks, kitchen boys, and servants toil over enormous hearths, preparing meals that reflect both wealth and status. Unlike the daily fare of peasants, which was limited and repetitive, noble banquets were showcases of abundance, variety, and artistry, designed to impress as much as to nourish. The noble kitchen was a world unto itself, often occupying an entire wing of a castle or manor. Large open hearths provided the heat necessary for roasting whole animals, boiling soups, and baking delicate pastries. Wooden tables were lined with mortars, knives and ladles, and piles of chopped vegetables, cured meats, and grains formed the raw materials for elaborate dishes. Cooks were skilled artisans, trained in techniques passed down through generations, capable of transforming humble ingredients into creations of visual and gustatory splendor. A typical noble feast might include multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last. The first course often featured soups and pottages, sometimes thickened with cream or enriched with meat. These were followed by roasted meats, swan, venison, boar, and occasionally peacock, served with sauces spiced with imported ingredients such as cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. Pies and pasties might encase delicate fillings of meat, fish, or vegetables, carefully folded and decorated to impress the eye. Sweet dishes concluded the meal, ranging from honeyed cakes to elaborate confections, infused with sugar and dried fruits. Every dish was intended not only to satisfy hunger, but also to display the lord's wealth, sophistication, and access to exotic goods. The scale of these banquets was staggering. In a great hall, dozens, if not hundreds, of guests could be served simultaneously. Platters were carried by liveried servants, dishes arranged in intricate displays, and goblets of wine passed from hand to hand. Meals were communal spectacles, with guests reclining on benches or chairs along long tables, engaging in conversation, storytelling, and music. Feasts marked important occasions, birthdays, weddings, treaties, or religious festivals, and often involved weeks of preparation, sourcing ingredients from far and wide. Seasonality remained a guiding principle, even in noble kitchens, though wealth and connections allowed for greater flexibility than in peasant households. Root vegetables and hearty greens were staples in winter, while spring brought tender shoots and fresh herbs. Game could be hunted throughout the year, while fish and fowl were supplied by rivers, lakes, or imported from distant lands. Exotic spices and preserved fruits allowed chefs to craft flavors and aromas that dazzled the senses and transported diners beyond the limits of local agriculture. The role of the chef extended beyond simple cooking. It was a form of artistry and theater. Presentation was as important as taste. With pies molded into animal shapes, pies and tarts decorated with intricate pastry designs, and platters arranged with colorful garnishes. Color, texture, and contrast were considered essential. Dishes might feature sweet and savory combinations, unexpected seasonings, and elaborate sauces that displayed mastery of technique and understanding of flavors. To dine in such a hall was to witness a performance as much as a meal. Beverages, too, reflected status and taste. Wine flowed freely, often spiced or mixed with honey to create mulled varieties. Ale and mead were available, though usually reserved for servants or laborers. Drinking vessels were carefully selected, Wooden mugs, pewter goblets, and ornate cups of silver or gold added to the pageantry of the table. Toasting, ritual drinking, and the clinking of goblets became part of the ceremonial rhythm of the feast, reinforcing social bonds and hierarchies. Yet for all the luxury, noble cuisine was not without its challenges and dangers. Preservation of meat and dairy remained precarious. Rotting or spoiled foods could cause illness even among the wealthy. Kitchens were hot, smoky, and dangerous places, with open flames, boiling liquids, and sharp tools claiming their share of injuries. Laborers worked tirelessly, often for little recognition, to ensure that each meal met the exacting standards of their lords. Moreover, extravagance could border on excess, with enormous quantities of food consumed simply to display wealth, sometimes to the detriment of practicality or sustainability. The contrast between peasant and noble diets was stark, but it highlights the social and economic divisions of medieval society. While peasants subsisted on coarse bread, porridge, and occasional vegetables or meat, nobles indulged in multiple courses of complex, richly flavored foods. Spices, sugar, and imported goods accentuated these differences, symbolizing status as much as taste. Even within noble households, hierarchy dictated who ate what. The lord and his family enjoyed the finest cuts and rarest ingredients, while retainers and lesser servants received portions far humbler. The feast, however, was not solely about indulgence. It reinforced social structure, religious practice, and political alliances. Blessings were said before meals, reflecting piety and gratitude. Guests were entertained with music, dancing, and storytelling, linking culinary experiences with broader cultural rituals. Feasts also allowed lords to assert dominance, host diplomatic discussions, and display their generosity and influence. Food was a tool of power, diplomacy, and social cohesion, extending far beyond simple sustenance. Even today, we can glimpse the sophistication of medieval noble cuisine through historical records and surviving cookbooks. Manuscripts such as La Viandia and The Form of Curie provide detailed recipes, revealing a fascination with flavor, presentation, and culinary creativity. These texts show that, despite the challenges of preservation and seasonal availability, medieval chefs were capable of remarkable artistry, blending local ingredients with imported luxuries to create unforgettable meals. As we leave the bustling kitchens and ornate halls of noble households, it is worth reflecting on the contrast this life of abundance had with the daily struggles of the peasantry. While nobles feasted on multiple courses of spiced meats, exotic fruits, and confections, peasants labored to secure enough sustenance to survive. Yet, both worlds were connected. The resources of the countryside fed the castle, and festivals or charitable distributions provided glimpses of luxury to those of humbler means. Food, in all its forms, remained central to medieval life, shaping daily existence, social hierarchies, and cultural identity. In our next chapter, we will explore the fascinating world of medieval spices, herbs, and flavorings, the rare ingredients that transformed both peasant and noble fare, adding depth, complexity, and sometimes danger to meals across Europe. As we transition from the grand halls of noble banquets, let us delve into the fragrant, mysterious world of spices and herbs, the ingredients that brought life, color, and a touch of magic to medieval cuisine. For peasants, the absence of such luxuries rendered their meals bland and repetitive. For nobles, however, these rare and precious items were the hallmark of wealth, status, and culinary sophistication. Imagine, if you will, a dimly lit spice merchant's shop, the air thick with the scents of cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and pepper. Sacks of dried herbs and bright powders line wooden shelves. Jars filled with exotic roots and seeds imported from lands far beyond Europe. A single pinch of saffron, golden as sunlight, could elevate a dish from ordinary to extraordinary. But the cost of these treasures was astronomical. Their value rivaled that of gold. In the 13th century, for example, a pound of pepper could equal the price of a cow, making it accessible only to the elite. The journey of spices from distant lands to European tables was a perilous and lengthy endeavor. Cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg traveled thousands of miles by land and sea, often passing through numerous hands: Arab merchants, Venetian traders, and finally, European importers, before reaching the kitchens of the wealthy. Along the way, these prized commodities faced the dangers of storms, bandits, and spoilage. Their rarity and high cost made them symbols of power, and their presence on a noble table was as much about status as it was about taste. For the average peasant, spices were beyond reach. Instead, their meals relied on more readily available flavorings such as garlic, mustard, onions, and vinegar. These humble ingredients could provide some variation, but they lacked the exotic allure and complex aroma of imported spices. Cabbages, leeks, and root vegetables were the mainstay, often boiled into thick pottages or stews that provided sustenance but little excitement for the palate. Herbs, however, were a different story. Many households, even modest ones, cultivated small gardens where herbs like parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme could be grown. These plants were more than culinary enhancers. They carried medicinal properties and were often used to treat minor ailments or add fragrance to the home. A pinch of rosemary could transform a humble roast, while sage lent depth to a simple stew. Herbs were the bridge between the scarcity of spices and the desire for flavor, allowing both peasants and nobles to experiment with taste in their own ways. In noble kitchens, the combination of herbs and spices became a true art form. Chefs carefully measured, mixed, and experimented to create balanced flavors. Sweet and savory often mingled in unexpected ways. Meat might be enhanced with honey, dried fruits, or candied peels, creating dishes that delighted the eye and the palate. Sauces, thickened with breadcrumbs or cream, and spiced with cinnamon or cloves, were draped over roasted meats, transforming simple ingredients into elaborate culinary creations. Spices also played a role in food preservation, particularly in the noble household. Pepper, cloves, and mustard seeds were sometimes used to mask the taste of meat that was past its freshest, a practice that, while not entirely safe by modern standards, extended the usability of perishable ingredients. In this way, flavor and function were intertwined, demonstrating the practical ingenuity of medieval cooks. The allure of spices went beyond taste. It was deeply symbolic. Brightly colored dishes signaled wealth and sophistication, while the presence of rare spices marked social rank. A banquet featuring peppered meats, saffron-colored sauces, and fragrant pies told visiting dignitaries that the host was well connected, prosperous, and cosmopolitan. Food was a language, and spices were its most eloquent vocabulary. Travelers, merchants, and crusaders contributed to the spread of both spices and knowledge of their uses. Returning crusaders brought back tales of fragrant bazaars in the East, of cinnamon and cloves being used in ways Europeans had never imagined. These stories fueled curiosity, demand, and eventually the establishment of trade routes that would reshape European cuisine for centuries to come. The desire for exotic flavor was a driving force behind exploration, commerce, and cultural exchange. Yet spices were not only for the tables of the rich. Monasteries and abbeys occasionally had access to small quantities, using them to enhance simple meals or medicinal remedies. Even in modest quantities, a pinch of cinnamon in a sweet bread or a dash of parsley in a vegetable stew could elevate an otherwise plain dish. The power of spices, in their rarity and aroma, reminded everyone of the broader world beyond the confines of their village or estate. Despite their utility and allure, spices could be dangerous if misused. Some were potent enough to irritate the stomach, or even cause illness in excessive amounts. Medieval chefs had to master not only the art of flavor, but also the science of balance, ensuring that their creations delighted without harm. Recipes passed down in manuscripts, meticulously recorded quantities, combinations, and methods, reflecting both caution and creativity. As we consider the role of herbs and spices, it becomes clear that medieval cuisine was not merely about sustenance. It was about culture, identity, and expression. Flavor became a statement, an assertion of status, knowledge, and refinement. Even the most humble cook, armed with garlic, onions, and parsley, participated in this tradition, exploring taste, texture, and aroma within the limits imposed by geography, season, and resources. As night falls and we leave behind the spice-scented corridors of noble kitchens, let us reflect on the extraordinary journey of flavor in medieval Europe. From humble herb gardens to vast trade networks spanning continents, the quest for taste shaped daily life, trade, and culture. The simple desire to transform a meal from bland sustenance into something memorable is a universal human impulse, one that transcends centuries and reminds us of our connection to the past. In our next chapter, we will explore the role of markets and trade in medieval food culture, bustling hubs where peasants, merchants, and nobles intersected, shaping the availability, price, and diversity of what ended up on every table, from porridge to pie. As we leave the spice-laden halls of the wealthy and the herb gardens of modest cottages behind, let us step into the bustling streets and open-air markets that were the lifeblood of medieval food culture. Picture, if you will, a cobbled square in a European town, alive with the clamor of merchants, the braying of livestock, and the chatter of peasants negotiating prices. This is where the rhythm of daily life converged with the necessities of sustenance, creating a vibrant, chaotic hub of trade, commerce, and survival. Markets were the meeting points of society. Here, the peasantry sold what little they could spare from their own fields: bundles of herbs, eggs, butter, small pigs, and seasonal vegetables. It was a chance to exchange labor and produce for the goods they could not grow themselves, such as salted fish, imported spices, or fine linens. For nobles and wealthy merchants, the market was a place to secure delicacies, luxury items, and exotic foods that symbolized status, wealth, and taste. In these spaces, the disparities of medieval life were on full display, with both abundance and scarcity present side by side. One could hear the calls of merchants hawking their wares. "Fresh apples! Sweet pears! Herring from the coast!" Children ran between stalls, dodging the hooves of donkeys and the clatter of wooden carts, while buyers examined goods for freshness, color, and quality. The market was not merely a place of commerce, it was a social hub, where news was exchanged, alliances formed, and community bonds maintained. Every transaction carried with it the story of human resilience, ingenuity, and negotiation. Trade routes extended far beyond the town square, linking medieval Europe with distant lands in a web of economic and cultural exchange. Venetian and Genoese merchants plied the Mediterranean, bringing spices, sugar, and olive oil from the Middle East, while northern traders carried furs, grains, and salt across the rivers and forests of Europe. These trade networks were the arteries that nourished cities, towns, and even remote villages, ensuring that food, whether simple or extravagant, could flow across great distances. Salt, in particular, was one of the most valuable commodities in medieval Europe, essential for preserving meat and fish. It could determine the survival of a household through long winters. Salt mines in Salzburg, Poland, and elsewhere were closely guarded, and the transport of this precious mineral was fraught with danger. Caravans laden with barrels of salt traveled long distances, often guarded against bandits and thieves. Without salt, the diet of peasants and nobles alike would have been drastically more precarious, highlighting how even a single commodity could shape daily life. Markets were also centers for processed and preserved foods. Bakers displayed crusty loaves of bread, alewives poured frothy mugs of ale, and butchers offered salted pork, smoked herring, and dried sausages. These items reflected the ingenuity required to stretch resources, preserve food through lean seasons, and survive in an unpredictable world. A handful of dried beans, a salted herring, or a loaf of rye bread could sustain a family for days or weeks, demonstrating how preservation was as important as production in medieval sustenance. Trade influenced not only the availability of food, but also its cost. Prices fluctuated with the seasons, harvests, and long-distance supply lines. A poor harvest or a blocked trade route could send food prices soaring, plunging peasants into hunger and forcing nobles to pay exorbitant sums for luxury items. Economic instability was a constant companion to medieval life, reminding every participant, merchant, peasant, and noble alike, that survival depended on careful planning, negotiation, and sometimes sheer luck. Interestingly, markets were also a space for cultural exchange. Spices, fruits, and vegetables from foreign lands introduced new flavors and cooking techniques to local populations. A Venetian trader might offer sugar from Cyprus, an Arab merchant cinnamon from Ceylon, or a Jewish peddler dried figs from North Africa. These ingredients were rare and expensive, yet they slowly infiltrated kitchens across Europe, blending with traditional herbs and local produce to create a culinary evolution that shaped tastes for generations to come. Despite their vitality, markets were not free from challenges. Crowds, weather, and the unpredictability of supply made them chaotic and sometimes dangerous. Thieves, opportunistic pickpockets, and dishonest merchants were common, requiring buyers to be vigilant and cunning. Weights and measures varied, and disputes were frequent. Local authorities often appointed market overseers to enforce fairness, regulate prices, and maintain order, but enforcement was inconsistent, leaving the markets to operate as semi-independent zones of commerce and negotiation. The markets also reflected the rhythms of the agricultural calendar. Spring brought fresh vegetables and young livestock. Summer overflowed with fruit and grains, and autumn yielded root crops, preserved goods, and wine. Winter, with its scarcity and frozen soils, transformed the market into a place of necessity rather than abundance, where dried and salted foods predominated. This seasonal cycle shaped not only what people ate, but how they lived, influencing festivals, feasts, and periods of fasting dictated by the church. For peasants, a visit to the market could be a rare opportunity to experience variety in their diet. Even a simple exchange, some eggs for dried beans, a hunk of cheese for a bundle of herbs, provided relief from monotony. For wealthier buyers, the market offered endless possibilities. From exotic spices to delicate pastries, each purchase a statement of refinement, taste, and social position. As we leave the noisy, fragrant, and colorful streets of the medieval market behind, we recognize that these centers were far more than places of food trade. They were a microcosm of medieval society, illustrating social hierarchies, economic interdependence, cultural exchange, and the human desire for sustenance and flavor. The market was where survival met creativity, scarcity met ingenuity, and the mundane act of buying and selling food became a reflection of the complex web of medieval life. In our next chapter, we will explore the art of cooking and preparation in medieval households. From the simplest peasant kitchen to the elaborate kitchens of the nobility, revealing how ingredients from fields and markets were transformed into meals that nourished, comforted, and sometimes amazed those who sat at the table. As we leave behind the lively streets of medieval markets, let us step into the kitchens and hearths, where the raw ingredients of the land were transformed into meals, however humble or extravagant. Picture a small cottage tucked on the edge of a village, smoke curling from a simple clay chimney, the warm glow of a fire flickering across stone walls. This is where the daily labor of sustenance was performed, a place where practicality met tradition, and where the realities of medieval life were reflected in the pots and pans, knives, and wooden spoons scattered about. For the peasant household, cooking was an all-encompassing task, one that consumed much of the day. The heart of the home was the hearth, a simple open-fire pit in which pots of pottage, grains, and stews were stirred over slowly smoldering embers. Meat, if available, was often boiled in water or added to thick broths alongside root vegetables like onions, turnips, and cabbages. Herbs from the garden, such as parsley, sage, or rosemary, were used sparingly to add flavor, though they were far from the exotic spices found in the kitchens of nobles. The fire provided both warmth and the means to cook, but it also demanded constant attention. A neglected hearth could quickly turn a meal into a charred mess, or worse, set the entire home ablaze. Peasants relied heavily on simple tools and techniques. Wooden spoons, clay pots, and iron cauldrons were essential, while baking was often limited to flatbreads cooked on hot stones or in communal ovens. The concept of individual stoves and ovens was a luxury reserved for wealthier households and monasteries. Cooking was labor-intensive, requiring patience, skill, and ingenuity. Every meal involved preparation, tending, and careful management of limited resources, particularly when firewood was scarce and precious. In noble households, kitchens were a vastly different affair, resembling small, organized factories rather than simple domestic spaces. Large hearths, multiple ovens, and dozens of specialized cooks and assistants enabled the preparation of elaborate feasts that could include dozens of dishes. Mates were roasted on spits that turned over open fires, sauces simmered in heavy cauldrons, and bread baked in brick ovens that retained heat for hours. The kitchens were hot, noisy, and smoky, filled with the constant clatter of pots, the hiss of boiling liquids, and the calls of cooks coordinating their work. These spaces demanded not only skill, but also a deep knowledge of flavors, textures, and presentation. One striking feature of medieval cooking was the use of both sweet and savory flavors together, a combination that might surprise modern palates. Dishes often included fruits, honey, and sugar alongside meats and spices, creating complex and sometimes pungent flavor profiles. While modern cuisine typically separates sweet and savory, medieval cooks embraced the interplay of tastes, reflecting a different culinary philosophy, one that prized extravagance and experimentation, especially among the upper classes. Monasteries played a unique role in the development of cooking and food knowledge. Monks and nuns tended extensive gardens, maintained orchards, and raised livestock, ensuring a steady supply of ingredients. They also recorded recipes in manuscripts, sharing techniques for stews, pies, and pastries. These cookbooks, though rare, offer a glimpse into medieval innovation and the sophistication that could be achieved with available ingredients. Some recipes included elaborate sauces, exotic spices, and precise instructions for roasting and baking, showcasing a level of culinary artistry far beyond the simple fare of the average peasant. Preparation methods varied by region and season. In Northern Europe, preservation was critical. Meats were salted or smoked, vegetables fermented, and fruits dried for the long winters. In southern regions, sun, dried herbs, olive oil, and fresh fruits were more common, reflecting the influence of climate and local agriculture. Seasonal variation shaped menus, dictating what could be eaten at any given time. Winter meals were often bland and monotonous, while summer allowed for fresher, more varied fare. Even with these methods, cooking was a risky endeavor. Open fires, hot oils, and sharp knives made injuries common. Smoke and soot-filled kitchens, creating a constant haze that left faces blackened and lungs irritated. Food poisoning was a real threat, particularly with meat that could spoil quickly without refrigeration. Both peasants and nobles faced the consequences of improperly stored or contaminated ingredients, highlighting the precariousness of life even at the hearth. For peasants, every meal was a balancing act between sustenance and survival. Porridges, gruels, and soups provided bulk and nutrition, while occasional meat or fish offered much needed protein. Leftovers were carefully reused, often boiled into the next day's meal or fed to animals to prevent waste. In contrast, noble kitchens offered abundance and choice, but also extravagance, with lavish presentations and elaborate dishes intended to impress and demonstrate power. Both contexts reveal a deep reliance on skill, knowledge, and adaptation, whether for survival or prestige. Kitchens were also centers of community and education. Children learned to cook alongside their parents or older siblings, acquiring skills necessary for survival. In noble households, young pages and apprentices observed seasoned cooks, learning the arts of roasting, baking, and flavoring. These spaces were not only about nourishment, they were places of learning, tradition, and cultural transmission, shaping generations through the act of preparing and sharing food. As we leave the flickering fires and fragrant aromas behind, it is clear that medieval cooking was much more than a simple act of feeding the body. It was a reflection of society, economy, climate, and culture, a daily exercise in resourcefulness and skill. Every meal carried with it the weight of survival, the creativity of the cook, and the influence of the surrounding world, from local markets to distant trade routes. In the next chapter, we will explore the feasts and banquets of the nobility, where food became not only nourishment, but spectacle, symbol, and a display of power, revealing the stark contrasts between the lives of peasants and the elite. As the smoke and soot of the humble peasant kitchens fade from our imagination, let us now step into the grand halls of medieval castles, where food took on a very different meaning. Picture an expansive chamber, its stone walls lined with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and battles long past. Flickering torches and a towering hearth illuminate long wooden tables, polished and adorned with intricate carvings. This is the setting for the feasts and banquets of the nobility, where food was more than sustenance. It was spectacle, status, and a reflection of power. A noble banquet was a carefully orchestrated event. Every dish was designed to impress, every course to convey wealth, sophistication, and influence. The menu could include dozens of items, ranging from roasted swan, peacock, and venison to delicate pastries, sweetmeats, and exotic fruits transported from distant lands. Spices such as cinnamon, ginger, and saffron, precious commodities in medieval Europe, were used liberally, not just to enhance flavor, but to signal status. The more exotic the spice, the greater the display of wealth and connection to far-reaching trade networks. The preparation of such a feast required a large team of skilled cooks, kitchen assistants, and servers. Kitchens in castles were busy, noisy, and complex environments, more akin to a modern professional kitchen than a domestic hearth. Roasts turned on spits over open flames. Sauces simmered in copper cauldrons, and pastries were meticulously shaped and filled. The sheer scale of the operation demanded organization and expertise, with master cooks overseeing apprentices and laborers to ensure that everything was ready for the grand presentation. Seating at a banquet was highly structured, reflecting the strict hierarchies of medieval society. The lord and lady of the castle presided at the high table, while lesser nobles, knights, and distinguished guests occupied tables of descending status. Servants moved swiftly among the diners, bringing platters, filling goblets with wine or ale, and ensuring that no guest was neglected. Every action, from the placement of dishes to the pouring of drinks, was guided by custom, etiquette, and the desire to display order and refinement. Presentation mattered immensely. Dishes were often elaborately arranged, with roasted birds dressed in their feathers or decorated with edible gold leaf. Pies were made with sculpted pastry, tops resembling castles, animals, or even human figures. The visual impact of the food was as important as the taste, a reminder to all present of the wealth and creativity of the host. In many ways, the banquet was a theater, with cooks, servers, and diners all playing their parts in a carefully choreographed display. Entertainment was inseparable from dining. Minstrels played lutes and harps, jesters performed acrobatics, and poets recited tales of chivalry and romance. Dancing could follow the meal, with nobles joining in the festivities once their hunger was sated. The feast became an immersive experience for all the senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, and a means to reinforce social bonds, alliances, and power structures within the noble class. Despite the extravagance, these feasts were not without danger. Food preservation remained limited, and spoiled meat or fish could easily make guests ill. Even the nobility were not immune to the risks of overindulgence. Tales abound of lords and kings who suffered from excessive consumption of rich foods, leading to digestive ailments, intoxication, or even death. Banquets were as much a display of courage and refinement as they were a test of restraint and endurance. Seasonality dictated many aspects of a banquet. In summer, fresh fruits, vegetables, and herbs added vibrancy to the table. Winter feasts relied on preserved ingredients, salted meats, dried fruits, and pickled vegetables. Game hunted in the surrounding forests provided protein year-round, and fish was abundant, particularly during religious fasts, when meat was forbidden. The creative use of available ingredients reflected both the skill of the cooks and the adaptability of the culinary tradition. Religion played a subtle yet significant role in noble dining. Church mandates on fasting and meatless days shaped menus, requiring cooks to devise meals that complied with ecclesiastical rules while still impressing the guests. Fish, eggs, cheese, and grains became staples during these periods, demonstrating that culinary artistry could thrive even under restrictions. The intersection of faith, law, and gastronomy added a layer of complexity to medieval banquets, where the kitchen was a space of both compliance and creativity. Wine and ale flowed freely, but again, moderation was a matter of skill and etiquette. Noble hosts prided themselves on the quality and rarity of their drinks, often importing wines from France, Spain, or the Mediterranean. The pairing of wine with food, though less formalized than modern practices, was carefully considered, and the abundance of drink reinforced the perception of prosperity and hospitality. Toasting, drinking rituals, and the sharing of cups strengthened bonds among the guests and emphasized social cohesion within the upper class. Feasts were also political instruments. A well-planned banquet could solidify alliances, intimidate rivals, or display generosity and power. Nobles who hosted grand dinners were sending a clear message that their household possessed wealth, resources, and sophistication unmatched by others. Diplomacy, court intrigue, and social maneuvering often played out against the backdrop of lavish meals, where words and gestures could carry as much weight as the food itself. Yet, even in this world of excess, contrasts remained stark. While the nobility revelled in abundance and indulgence, the majority of the population subsisted on far simpler fare, as we explored in previous chapters. The divide between peasant and noble life was reflected in the very act of eating, a reminder of social stratification and the unequal distribution of resources. The banquet was a window into privilege and status, as much a performance of wealth as a moment of nourishment. As we step back from the echoing hallways and glittering tables, it becomes clear that medieval noble feasts were more than meals. They were celebrations of life, power, and culture. They highlight the ingenuity, artistry, and resourcefulness of cooks, and the complex interplay between food, society, and politics. Every bite, every drink, and every gesture carried meaning far beyond mere sustenance. In our next chapter, we will explore the challenges of food preservation and storage, where even the grandest kitchens face the relentless march of time and the ever-present threat of spoilage. As the echoes of noble banquets fade, let us turn our attention to a quieter but equally vital aspect of medieval life: the preservation and storage of food. Imagine the cool, shadowy cellars beneath castles and manor houses, the musty, smelling pantries of townhouses, and the humble storerooms of peasant cottages. These were spaces of ingenuity and necessity, where every scrap of food had to be protected from spoilage, pests, and the harsh hand of time. In a world without refrigeration, canning, or modern preservation techniques, the survival of a family, or even an entire household, depended on careful planning and clever methods of storage. For peasants, the challenges of preservation were immediate and practical. Grain, the backbone of their diet, had to be stored in such a way as to prevent mold, infestation, or loss. Barley, wheat, and rye were kept in bens or sacks, often elevated above the damp floors to deter vermin. The smallest oversight could mean weeks of labor wasted, leaving a family vulnerable to hunger in lean months. Legumes like beans and peas, which supplemented the diet, were dried carefully and stored in woven baskets or clay jars, sealed to keep moisture and pests at bay. In an age when every calorie mattered, nothing could be wasted. Meat and fish presented even greater challenges. Without ice or refrigeration, fresh protein could not be kept for more than a day or two. Peasants relied heavily on techniques like salting, smoking, and drying to extend the life of what little meat they had. A small piece of pork might be cured in salt for weeks, or a fish hung from a rafter to air, dry until it became tough but edible. Smoking was a labor-intensive process, requiring the construction of smokehouses, where meat or fish could be exposed to smoke for days. These methods imparted distinct flavors to food, creating tastes that modern palates might find unusual, but which were essential for survival. In towns and cities, food storage was equally precarious, but merchants and wealthier households had more options. Root cellars were common, cool and dark spaces dug into the earth or built into the foundations of buildings. They provided ideal conditions for storing hardy vegetables like carrots, turnips, onions, and cabbages. Fruits were dried or turned into preserves with sugar or honey, which, though expensive, allowed for the storage of delicacies like apples, pears, or quinces. Barrels of salted fish lined the shelves, while baskets of dried legumes and grains filled every available corner. The skillful arrangement and rotation of stock were crucial. The slightest lapse could result in loss or contamination. Salt was the cornerstone of medieval preservation. Without it, the storage of meat, fish, and even some dairy products would have been nearly impossible. Salting not only drew out moisture, which bacteria and mold required to thrive, but also infused the food with flavor. Salted herring, cod, or pork could last for months if properly prepared, providing a lifeline during winter or periods of scarcity. Salt was so valuable that it was often heavily taxed, and entire trade routes, known as salt roads, were dedicated to transporting it across Europe. The ability to preserve food effectively was therefore not just a matter of survival, but also a reflection of wealth and access to resources. Smoking was another essential technique, particularly for protein. Fish, pork, and beef were hung in smokehouses, their fibers absorbing aromatic compounds that slowed decay. The process required careful monitoring, as too much smoke could render food bitter, while too little left it vulnerable to spoilage. Smoking also had a communal dimension. Entire villages might participate in preparing hams, sausages, or smoked fish for winter storage. This labor-intensive practice fostered cooperation and shared knowledge, essential for sustaining communities in a precarious world. Dairy products, though central to many diets, were particularly perishable. Milk could quickly sour, turning into curds or cheese, while butter needed to be churned, salted, or stored in cool cellars. Some monasteries developed sophisticated methods for cheese making, producing hard cheeses that could last for months or even years. These techniques were often closely guarded, with monks and skilled artisans passing down recipes and processes from generation to generation. In monasteries, food preservation was both a practical necessity and a spiritual practice, reflecting the order, discipline, and care that defined monastic life. Honey played a surprisingly important role in preservation as well. It was used not only as a sweetener, but also as a natural preservative for fruits, nuts, and even some meats. Jars of honey could keep foods edible for months, a crucial advantage during winters or long journeys. Candied fruits, often coated in honey or sugar, were rare treats, but they exemplified the ingenuity of medieval preservation techniques. Even bread could be dried and hardened to extend its shelf life, creating a form of sustenance that could travel or last through famine. Yet, despite these efforts, food storage remained a gamble. Rodents, insects, damp, and human error could undo weeks of careful preparation. Rotten or contaminated food posed serious health risks, contributing to disease and malnutrition. Wealthy households fared better, but even they were not immune to the challenges of a world without refrigeration. Every loaf of bread, every barrel of salted fish, and every cured ham represented hours of labor, careful attention, and the delicate balance of time and technique. The strategies of food preservation in medieval times were thus a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. They reveal a society that adapted to its limitations, finding creative solutions to the pressing problem of sustenance. From smoky cellars to salt-laden barrels, from dried legumes to honeyed preserves, medieval Europeans employed every tool at their disposal to ensure survival. These methods shaped not only daily life, but also culinary culture, leaving a legacy that informs the evolution of food preparation and storage today. As we leave the cool darkness of medieval storage rooms, it becomes clear that preserving food was as much an art as a science. The ingenuity, patience, and diligence required were vital for survival and for the continuity of communities. In our next chapter, we will explore medieval cooking techniques, uncovering the ways people transformed raw ingredients into meals that nourished the body and sustained the spirit. As we leave the shadowy storage rooms behind, let us step into the warm, smoky kitchens of medieval Europe, where the act of cooking was as essential to survival as it was a daily ritual. Picture a small cottage or a bustling manor kitchen. Open hearths with flickering flames, cauldrons simmering over hot embers, and the scent of herbs, grains, and roasted meat mingling in the air. In an era long before ovens, stoves, or modern kitchen appliances, cooking was a labor-intensive process that demanded skill, patience, and a deep understanding of fire, ingredients, and timing. For peasants, cooking was often simple, functional, and repetitive. A typical meal might involve boiling grains, legumes, or root vegetables into a thick pottage, a kind of stew that provided nourishment and filled the belly, even if it lacked variety or flavor. Imagine a family gathered around a single pot, stirring the contents to prevent scorching, while keeping an eye on the fire, adjusting the placement of coals to control the heat. This humble method was efficient, conserving both fuel and resources, but it required constant attention. Burn the pottage, and hunger would follow, undercook it, and digestion might suffer. Cooking over an open hearth required a unique skill set. Fire was unpredictable, and heat had to be managed manually. Pots were suspended over flames by hooks or tripods, their contents stirred with wooden spoons or paddles. Roasting meat involved skewers or spits turned by hand, or, in wealthier households, by a mechanical spit powered by gears and weights. The process of turning a spit, known as spit turning, could be exhausting, particularly for large joints of meat that needed hours to cook thoroughly. Every meal was a balancing act between patience, precision, and improvisation. For the nobility, cooking became an elaborate affair. Castles often employed a team of cooks and kitchen staff to prepare grand banquets that could feed dozens, if not hundreds, of guests. Kitchens were labyrinthine, with multiple hearths, ovens, and roasting spits, designed to accommodate complex dishes and the simultaneous preparation of meats, sauces, breads, and desserts. Recipes might call for precise timing, multiple stages of preparation, and the careful layering of flavors through herbs, spices, and sauces. Imagine the head cook coordinating a small army of assistants, all working in tandem to ensure that every dish was ready at the exact moment it was needed. Precision, hierarchy, and timing were as important in the kitchen as on the battlefield. Herbs and spices played a crucial role in medieval cooking, particularly for the wealthy. While peasants relied on simple seasonings like salt, vinegar, and onions, noble kitchens could access a dazzling array of imported spices: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and pepper. These exotic ingredients were expensive, sometimes costing as much as gold, and they transformed dishes from bland sustenance into elaborate culinary creations. A roasted bird might be stuffed with spiced fruits and nuts, its skin glazed with honey and adorned with delicate sauces. Each flavor, each scent, was carefully orchestrated to impress not only the palate, but also the eyes of the diners. Medieval cooks also employed creative techniques to stretch ingredients and minimize waste. Leftover meats and vegetables might be repurposed into pies, stews, or broths. The use of offal, organ meats such as liver, heart, and kidneys, was common, particularly among peasants, while more privileged households incorporated these cuts into refined recipes. Baking was another essential technique, with bread serving as a staple in every meal. Hearth ovens, stone ovens, and portable clay ovens allowed for baking loaves, flatbreads, and pastries, though controlling temperature was a constant challenge. Burnt bread was a frequent hazard, and a poorly baked loaf could mean hunger or illness. Sauces and broths were a cornerstone of medieval cuisine, particularly in the upper classes. Cookbooks from the period reveal a sophisticated understanding of balancing flavors, combining sweet, sour, and salty elements. Vinegar, wine, and fermented liquids were commonly used to enhance dishes, while herbs added fragrance and subtlety. Pottage, the ubiquitous peasant stew, could be spiced with whatever was available, from garlic and mustard to wild herbs, gathered from the surrounding countryside. Even in the simplest meals, the desire to enhance flavor demonstrates the timeless human craving for enjoyment in food, no matter the era. Cooking was also tied to social and religious life. Fasting periods, such as Lent, required the preparation of meatless meals, which pushed cooks to innovate with grains, legumes, vegetables, and fish. Monastic kitchens were particularly skilled at creating satisfying meatless dishes, using dairy, eggs, and seasonings to craft meals that nourished both body and soul. Feasts and festivals, on the other hand, allowed for indulgence, displaying the wealth and status of the host through elaborate dishes, pastries, and sugar work, a rarity and a luxury that astonished peasants who subsisted on basic fare. Fuel management was another practical consideration. Wood was the primary source of heat, though charcoal was occasionally used in wealthier kitchens for more controlled cooking. Fires had to be carefully maintained. Too little heat meant undercooked meals, while excessive flames could scorch pots or burn food entirely. In some castles, cooks even built specialized hearths with adjustable grates, allowing for better control over temperature and cooking times. These innovations highlight the ingenuity of medieval cooks, who worked with the tools and knowledge available to create meals that were, for their time, both practical and sometimes extraordinary. Despite the challenges, medieval cooks displayed remarkable creativity, resourcefulness, and resilience. They adapted to seasonal availability, regional differences, and economic constraints, transforming raw ingredients into meals that nourished the body and sustained communities. Cooking was not merely a chore, it was a craft, a reflection of culture, and a testament to human adaptability in a world without modern conveniences. As we leave the bustling kitchens of medieval Europe, we can appreciate the artistry and ingenuity that went into each meal. From peasant stews to noble banquets, the act of cooking was a delicate balance of necessity, skill, and creativity. In our next chapter, we will explore the role of spices and flavorings, uncovering how the pursuit of taste shaped trade, culture, and culinary traditions across medieval Europe. As the smoke from the hearth drifts into the rafters, let us turn our minds to the intoxicating aromas that could, in an instant, elevate a simple meal into a feast worthy of kings and queens. In the medieval world, spices were not merely flavorings. They were symbols of wealth, power, and connection to distant lands. Imagine the dusty roads of Venice, the bustling ports of Genoa, or the crowded marketplaces of Constantinople, where sacks of cinnamon, cloves, pepper, and nutmeg arrived from far-flung corners of the globe. To the ordinary peasant, such scents were almost magical. To the nobility, they were essential tools of status and taste. Spices were prized for both their culinary and medicinal properties. A pinch of pepper could transform bland meats into something exciting. Cinnamon and cloves were used not only to flavor desserts, but also to mask the sometimes questionable freshness of preserved foods. Nutmeg, cardamom, and ginger added warmth and complexity, while saffron painted dishes in golden hues, signaling wealth and refinement. In a time before refrigeration or modern preservation, the ability to season food well was a mark of sophistication, and a way to make limited ingredients more enjoyable. The journey of these exotic goods from distant lands to European kitchens was perilous and costly. Spices traveled thousands of miles over treacherous land routes, such as the Silk Road, or across stormy seas, often passing through multiple hands before reaching their final destination. Caravans and ships faced bandits, pirates, and harsh weather, and the merchants who risked their lives often charged exorbitant prices to compensate. Consider that, in the 14th century, a pound of pepper might cost more than a month's wages for a skilled laborer. Nutmeg and cloves were even more precious, coveted almost as much as gold. Trade in spices also shaped medieval economies and politics. Italian states like Venice and Genoa became wealthy and influential largely because they controlled the flow of these coveted goods. Merchant families amassed fortunes, funded armies, and built palaces, all fueled by the demand for flavor from the Mediterranean to the far reaches of northern Europe. Spices became a form of currency, a way to display social status, and a tool of diplomacy. Gifts of rare spices could curry favor with kings or seal alliances between noble houses. For the peasantry, however, spices remained largely out of reach. Their daily meals were dominated by the monotony of grains, legumes, and locally grown vegetables. Only on rare occasions, such as a festival or a wedding feast hosted by their lord, might they encounter the tantalizing aroma of cinnamon or pepper. Even then, these flavors were often used sparingly, as the cost was prohibitive. To a medieval peasant, a taste of such spices was a fleeting glimpse of a world far removed from the struggle for survival. Spices also carried religious and cultural significance. During the preparation of meatless Lenten dishes, for example, cooks would use a blend of herbs and spices to add flavor and excitement, turning simple fare into something worthy of ritual observance. Monasteries, with their carefully tended gardens and access to imported goods, became centers of culinary experimentation, creating herbal remedies, spiced wines, and innovative dishes that influence both lay and noble cuisine. The fascination with spices also influenced preservation techniques. Salting, pickling, and smoking foods were common practices, but the addition of exotic flavorings helped improve the taste of preserved items. Dried fruits, when combined with sugar and spices, could elevate humble porridge or bread into a treat that rivaled even noble delicacies. In this way, spices were more than luxury. They were a practical means of making preserved or less than fresh food palatable. Trade in spices also had unintended consequences. The desire for direct access to these precious commodities sparked exploration and conflict. Merchants sought new routes to bypass middlemen and reduce costs, leading to voyages across the Mediterranean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and eventually across the Atlantic. While these ventures are often remembered for their political or geographic significance, at heart they were driven by the simple human desire to taste a better meal. One might say that the quest for flavor fueled an age of discovery. In noble kitchens, the use of spices was an art form. Recipes from medieval cookbooks demonstrate careful layering of flavors, combining sweet, sour, salty, and aromatic notes in surprising ways. Roast meats might be rubbed with a mixture of pepper, cinnamon, and crushed herbs, then basted in wine and honey. Sauces combined vinegar, wine, fruits, and spices, creating a complex profile that would tantalize the palate. Presentation was equally important. Dishes were often elaborately garnished, with vibrant colors achieved using saffron, parsley, or other natural dyes, signaling both culinary skill and social rank. Even as spices dazzled the wealthy, their scarcity and cost highlighted the stark contrast between classes. While a baron might enjoy a spiced pheasant and a goblet of mulled wine, a peasant's dinner remained a simple pot of pottage. seasoned with little more than salt and perhaps a sprig of locally grown herbs. This disparity was a daily reminder of the unequal distribution of resources, of how access to flavor, like wealth and power, was reserved for a fortunate few. Yet, despite the cost and difficulty, the allure of spices endured. They shaped tastes, trade networks, and even geopolitics, leaving an enduring mark on European cuisine. By the time the late Middle Ages rolled around, spices had become integral to celebrations, diplomacy, and the very idea of indulgence. They were a reminder that food was never merely sustenance. It was a reflection of culture, ambition, and human curiosity. As we leave the busy spice markets and fragrant kitchens behind, let us carry with us the understanding that the search for flavor was more than just a culinary pursuit. It was a journey across continents, a catalyst for trade, and a driver of human innovation. In our next chapter, we will explore the everyday kitchen tools and utensils that made medieval cooking possible, from clay pots and wooden spoons to the ingenious devices that helped cooks manage fire and heat. Imagine, if you will, stepping into a medieval kitchen, where the air is thick with smoke from an open hearth and the scent of simmering pottage drifts into every corner. The tools of the trade are simple yet indispensable. Rough, hewn wooden spoons, clay pots blackened by fire, iron cauldrons suspended above flames, and knives that are as much instruments of necessity as they are symbols of craftsmanship. In these kitchens, survival depended on ingenuity and resourcefulness, and every utensil had a purpose. For the average peasant, kitchen tools were modest and multifunctional. A single wooden spoon might serve for stirring, serving, and even tasting. Clay pots, often handmade in the village, were the vessels in which grains, legumes, and vegetables were boiled into pottage, the cornerstone of the peasant diet. These humble items were subject to wear and breakage. A cracked pot might be repaired with clay or discarded entirely. Cooking over an open fire demanded skill and attention, as the flame was unpredictable and the heat could easily scorch a meal or ignite the straw and wood surrounding the hearth. Iron cauldrons were more durable but required considerable labor to maintain. Seasoning the metal and keeping it free from rust was crucial, and families often passed down well-used cauldrons through generations, suspended from a tripod or hung on a hook above the hearth. These vessels were versatile, boiling water, cooking stews, or even brewing ale for domestic consumption. The size of the cauldron often reflected the household's wealth and capacity to prepare meals for multiple members at once. Knives were indispensable in every kitchen. Not only were they used for preparing food, but they doubled as tools for butchering animals, carving wood, and even defending against vermin that threatened precious supplies. Unlike modern cutlery, spoons and knives were communal in many households, shared among family members, while forks were rare in Europe until the late Middle Ages, often considered a luxury or a tool for the clergy. Eating, stirring, and serving were acts deeply intertwined, and one utensil often had to fulfill multiple roles. Among the more specialized tools were mortars and pestles, essential for grinding spices, herbs, and grains, for the few who had access to imported spices like pepper, cloves, and cinnamon. The mortar and pestle allowed cooks to release maximum flavor. Grain mills, either hand-operated or powered by water, were used to turn wheat, barley, or rye into flour, a labor-intensive process but critical for bread making. Without these tools, the staple diet of peasants and nobles alike would be impossible to sustain. Cooking over an open flame also demanded ingenuity. Tripods, hooks, and cranes were used to suspend pots over the hearth, allowing cooks to adjust heat by raising or lowering the vessel. Clay ovens, often small and rudimentary, allowed for baking bread, though temperature control was rudimentary at best. Bread, which was essential for survival, required constant attention, too little heat, and it remained doughy, too much and it burned. For peasants, an oven might be shared among neighbors, a community resource that added both efficiency and social interaction. Medieval kitchens, whether in humble cottages or grand castles, were rarely clean by modern standards. Ash, soot, and spilled food covered surfaces, attracting rats, flies, and other pests. Despite these conditions, cooks developed clever methods to maintain some semblance of order. Hooks for hanging tools, shelves for storing dry goods, and clay jars for liquids and grains all contributed to an organized workspace. Even in squalid conditions, ingenuity and resourcefulness allowed people to make the most of what they had. In castles, kitchen tools were often more elaborate. Large cauldrons and spits were used to roast whole animals, turning over a fire for hours at a time. Mechanical spits, powered by clockwork or a system of weights, allowed cooks to manage large feasts with less physical labor. Knives, forks, and ladles were often ornately crafted, reflecting the status of the noble household. Copper pots, polished to a shine, were prized for their heat conduction and durability. The scale of these kitchens was immense, with multiple hearths and staff of specialized cooks, each responsible for specific dishes or techniques. The organization of a castle kitchen also reflected hierarchy and specialization. Master cooks oversaw the preparation of banquets, while apprentices and servants carried out the labor-intensive tasks. Herbs were stored in bunches or dried in the lofts. Meats were salted or smoked for preservation, and vegetables were meticulously cleaned and chopped. For the nobility, the act of cooking was as much about theater as sustenance, a display of skill and wealth meant to impress guests and reinforce social standing. Even the simplest kitchens had to contend with the limitations of the time. Water was scarce and often carried from wells or rivers, introducing the constant risk of contamination. Heat sources were uncontrolled, and firewood had to be gathered, chopped, and carefully managed. Cooks learned to adapt, using lids to control boiling, adding cold water to prevent scorching, or suspending pots to regulate cooking speed. The mastery of these techniques often determined whether a meal was edible or ruined. Through all these challenges, medieval cooks demonstrated creativity and resilience. The tools they wielded were extensions of their skill and ingenuity, enabling them to transform simple, meager ingredients into nourishing meals. From a humble wooden spoon to an ornate copper cauldron, each utensil tells a story of human adaptation, of survival, and of the desire to create comfort and flavor in an often harsh and unforgiving world. As we step back from the hearth and consider the array of tools that made medieval cooking possible, we see more than just objects. We see ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the enduring human drive to improve life through skill and imagination. In our next chapter, we will explore how preservation methods shaped medieval diets, from salting and smoking to pickling and fermenting, revealing the extraordinary lengths to which people went to store food and stave off hunger. Picture, if you will, a medieval kitchen in late autumn. The last of the summer's vegetables have been harvested, the livestock are still grazing, and the chill of winter begins to creep into the air. For the average household, this is a time of preparation and foresight. Fresh food will soon be scarce, and survival depends on the skillful preservation of what little the family has. In a world without refrigerators, freezers, or modern canning methods, medieval people had to rely on ingenuity, resourcefulness, and tradition to ensure their food would last through the cold months ahead. One of the most common preservation methods was salting. Salt, a precious and sometimes expensive commodity, was used to cure meat and fish, drawing out moisture and creating an environment inhospitable to bacteria. For families with access to salt, pork, beef, and herring were frequently treated this way, then stored in barrels or ceramic jars. Salted meat could last for months, providing sustenance during lean winter times. The process was labor-intensive and required careful attention to ensure that all surfaces were thoroughly salted. For coastal communities, salt was often harvested from evaporated seawater, a delicate process that made it a valuable and sometimes contested resource. Smoking was another method used to extend the shelf life of meat and fish. The smoke itself contained chemicals that slowed the growth of bacteria, while the drying effect removed excess moisture. In smokehouses, wooden racks were stacked with cuts of meat or whole fish, and slow smoldering fires infused the food with flavor while preserving it. This method was not only practical, but also added a distinct taste to the diet. However, the smoky aroma was strong and often permeated the entire household, a constant reminder of the struggle to make food last. Drying was a simpler yet equally essential technique. Fruits like apples, pears, and plums were peeled, sliced, and laid out in the sun or hung over warm hearths to dehydrate. Grains were also dried and stored in sacks, protected from moisture and pests as best as possible. Once dried, these foods could be stored for months without spoiling, providing vital nutrients and variety to a diet often dominated by bland staples. For peasants and nobles alike, dried food was a practical solution to seasonal scarcity, a way to stretch the bounty of harvests into the harsh winter months. Pickling added both flavor and longevity to vegetables. Cucumbers, onions, cabbage, and other produce were submerged in brine or vinegar, creating an acidic environment that preserved them. Sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, was especially common, providing both sustenance and a source of essential vitamins when fresh greens were unavailable. The process of pickling was slow and required skill. The balance of salt, water, and air exposure determined whether the food would be edible or spoiled. In many households, large ceramic jars were set aside specifically for this purpose, often stored in cool cellars to maintain freshness. Honey and sugar played a surprisingly important role in preservation. Honey, a natural antibacterial agent, was used to coat or store fruits, creating a sweet and long-lasting treat. Sugar, while rarer and more expensive, was similarly employed by wealthier households to preserve fruits and create syrups that could keep for months. These sweet preservation methods were luxurious, providing both taste and nourishment, and were particularly valued during the cold months when fresh produce was scarce. Cold storage was limited but effective when available. Cool cellars, shaded pits, or cold streams were used to store perishable items. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were buried in sand or straw to protect them from frost and moisture. Ice harvested from frozen ponds in winter could be packed around food for temporary refrigeration. Though this was labor-intensive and required careful handling to prevent spoilage, these methods were practical, relying on nature itself to provide the cold needed for food storage. Despite all these preservation techniques, medieval food remained precarious. Contamination from pests, rodents, and poor sanitation was a constant threat. Rats and mice often gnawed through barrels and sacks, while flies and insects carried bacteria. Families had to be vigilant, inspecting stored foods regularly and discarding anything that showed signs of spoilage. Even with careful preparation, the risk of illness from preserved food was high, and periods of scarcity were never far away. Interestingly, The type of preservation often reflected social status. Wealthier households could afford imported salt, access to smokehouses, and sugar for sweet preservation. They also maintained large cellars and cool storage areas, allowing for more diverse and reliable food supplies. Peasant households, by contrast, relied more heavily on drying and pickling, using what was locally available and affordable. Yet, even among the poor, creativity and resourcefulness were paramount. Preserving food was as much a survival skill as it was a culinary practice, and mastery of these techniques often determined a family's ability to endure the winter months. These preservation methods also influenced the flavor and texture of medieval cuisine. Salted, smoked, or pickled foods were distinct from the fresh ingredients we enjoy today, creating a diet that was often harsh and pungent. Meals were shaped as much by necessity as by taste, a reminder that sustenance, not pleasure, was the primary goal. Yet, within these constraints, cooks found ways to create variety, combining preserved ingredients into stews, pottages, and breads, transforming humble staples into meals that nourished both body and spirit. As we consider the lengths to which medieval people went to keep food edible, we gain insight into their resilience and ingenuity. The act of preserving food was not just a matter of practicality, it was a testament to human creativity in the face of scarcity. Each salted herring, smoked ham, or jar of pickled cabbage tells a story of adaptation, foresight, and survival, reflecting the daily struggles and triumphs of people navigating a world without modern conveniences. In our next chapter, we will explore how medieval festivals and feast days punctuated the calendar, offering rare moments of abundance and celebration amidst the daily challenges of sustaining life. These occasions reveal the stark contrast between ordinary survival and extraordinary indulgence, providing a window into the social and cultural dimensions of medieval food. Imagine stepping into a bustling medieval village on the morning of a festival day. The streets are alive with activity, and the air is filled with a mix of excitement, aromas, and the occasional whiff of less pleasant odors. For the peasants who spent their days toiling in the fields and kitchens, festivals were rare breaks from the monotony of survival. These celebrations punctuated the calendar, bringing both joy and indulgence, albeit within the constraints of medieval life. They were a time when the usual restrictions on diet and labor could be loosened, and communities could come together in shared merriment. The medieval calendar was filled with religious feast days, each associated with a saint, holy event, or seasonal celebration. The most significant of these was Easter, a time of resurrection and renewal, marked by elaborate rituals, processions, and the lifting of fasting restrictions. Christmas was another major festival, combining Christian traditions with lingering pagan customs, including feasting, dancing, and gift-giving. Lesser saints' days and local fairs dotted the year, offering more modest opportunities for celebration, yet still providing a break from the daily grind. Food was, naturally, the centerpiece of these festivals. For ordinary villagers, even a simple festival meal could feel like a banquet. Stews were thickened with additional vegetables or legumes. Meats that were usually reserved for special occasions were roasted or boiled in rich sauces, and bread was often of a higher quality than the coarse loaves consumed day to day. Spices, though still expensive, might make a fleeting appearance, transforming humble dishes into fragrant, exotic treats. Sweet foods, such as pastries and honeyed cakes, were especially prized, for sugar and honey were scarce commodities in peasant households. Feasts often incorporated the animals that had been tended for months. Pigs, chickens, and geese were slaughtered for these occasions, with every part used creatively. Organs, bones, and scraps were made into broths and pottages for the poorer attendees, ensuring that no part of the animal went to waste. For wealthier villagers and minor nobility, the abundance of meat symbolized status and prosperity, reinforcing social hierarchies, even amidst communal celebration. Drinking played an equally important role in festivals. Ale and mead flowed more freely than on ordinary days, and wine might appear in households that could afford it. These beverages were safer to consume than water, and their consumption was often accompanied by singing, dancing, and games. Drinking was as much a communal ritual as it was a dietary necessity, creating bonds among participants and offering a temporary escape from the rigors of daily life. Music, dancing, and performances elevated the festive atmosphere. Traveling minstrels, jugglers, and storytellers entertained villagers, adding color and vitality to the proceedings. Children were allowed to run freely, and adults could indulge in games of skill, mock combat, and contests of wit. The festive environment offered a temporary leveling of society. Peasants, minor nobles, and artisans shared the same streets, the same food, and the same songs. Yet, beneath the surface, the social hierarchies remained intact, reinforced subtly through seating arrangements, distribution of prized foods, and ceremonial roles in religious observances. Religious observances and pageantry remained central, even as indulgence and entertainment were encouraged. Mass and processions marked the spiritual core of these festivals, reminding participants of divine order and reinforcing moral values. Saints' relics were often displayed, and rituals such as blessing the crops or livestock tied the celebration directly to the community's survival and prosperity. Even in the midst of revelry, the medieval mindset linked joy to spiritual purpose, emphasizing gratitude and piety alongside pleasure. For the nobility, festival days could be even more extravagant. Banquets in castles featured multiple courses of roasted meats, pies, tarts, and delicacies that reflected wealth and access to imported ingredients. Spices like saffron, cinnamon, and nutmeg perfumed the air, while elaborate presentations of peacocks, swans, and other exotic fowl symbolized the Lord's power and sophistication. These feasts were also political tools, opportunities for forging alliances, displaying generosity, and maintaining social hierarchies. Servants and cooks labored for hours, preparing intricate dishes that could amaze guests and convey prestige. Yet, despite the joy and abundance, festivals were also reminders of the fragility of life and sustenance. A single poorly preserved dish could cause illness, and the sudden consumption of rich foods, after long periods of scarcity, could overwhelm the body. For peasants unaccustomed to heavy or rich meals, festival indulgence came with both delight and risk. Observing the careful choreography of meals, distribution, and rituals reveals the delicate balance medieval people maintained between celebration and survival. Festivals also served as a form of social cohesion, uniting communities through shared experiences and collective memory. They were opportunities to strengthen bonds, teach younger generations traditions, and reaffirm local identity. Seasonal fairs, often timed with harvests, allowed villagers to trade goods, share knowledge, and participate in broader networks of commerce and communication. These events reminded medieval people of their place within a larger social and economic order, even as they temporarily loosened its rigid constraints. In reflecting on medieval festivals and feast days, we see a world where food was far more than nourishment. It was a symbol, a social tool, and a marker of both privilege and survival. The excitement of a festival offered a temporary reprieve from hunger and monotony, while also reinforcing the spiritual, social, and economic structures that governed daily life. In essence, these celebrations were microcosms of medieval existence itself, a blend of hardship and joy, scarcity and abundance, the mundane and the magnificent. As we let our imagination linger on the sights, smells, and sounds of a festival day in a medieval village, we gain a deeper appreciation for the resilience, ingenuity, and communal spirit of our ancestors. Even amid scarcity and adversity, they found moments of joy and human connection, illustrating that the capacity to celebrate and find pleasure is as enduring as the struggle to survive. In our next chapter, we will explore the role of seasonal and local markets and how these bustling hubs of trade shaped what was available on the medieval table, connecting communities and influencing diet in profound ways. Picture a crisp morning in a medieval town, the sun just beginning to warm the narrow cobblestone streets. Villagers, traders, and travelers converge on the marketplace, the heartbeat of local commerce. The air is alive with the shouts of merchants, the clatter of wooden carts, and the mingling sense of fresh bread, cured meats, herbs, and the occasional less pleasant aroma of unwashed animals and refuse. Markets were more than places to buy and sell. They were the arteries that connected the peasant, artisan, and noble to the broader rhythms of medieval life. For peasants, the market was both necessity and spectacle. Here they could trade surplus produce, barter goods, and purchase items otherwise unavailable in the home village. A farmer might exchange freshly harvested onions, cabbage, or barley for salt, iron tools, or a small ration of sugar. Barter often took precedence over coin, particularly in poorer regions, reflecting a world where money was scarce and survival relied on flexibility and negotiation. Seasonal markets, often tied to religious feast days or harvest periods, punctuated the year, offering predictable opportunities for trade and social interaction. The rhythm of medieval markets was closely linked to the agricultural calendar. Spring markets brought early vegetables and young livestock, while summer fairs offered a bounty of fruits, grains, and fresh fish. Autumn harvests were celebrated with an abundance of produce, often preserved for the winter months, while winter markets featured root vegetables, salted meats, and dried goods. For those living in rural villages, traveling to a market could be a rare adventure, a chance to see exotic items brought from distant towns, or countries saffron from the Middle East, dried figs from the Mediterranean, or fine cloth woven hundreds of miles away. Market stalls were a chaotic yet fascinating mix of commodities. Local bakers displayed round loaves, often uneven and coarse, while millers peddled flour and meal, occasionally adulterated with fillers. Butchers brought cuts of pork, beef, or mutton, carefully, or sometimes not so carefully, prepared and displayed. Fishmongers offered dried, smoked or salted fish, while fruit vendors showcased apples, pears, and seasonal berries. Herbs, honey, and small quantities of spices were prized commodities, their value reflected in careful weighing and negotiation. Every item told a story: where it came from, how it was grown, and the skill required to bring it to the market. The marketplace was also a center of community life. Villagers caught up on news, gossip, and rumors. Traveling minstrels, performers, and storytellers provided entertainment, while wandering monks and clerics sometimes distributed alms or preached. Markets served as informal information hubs, allowing peasants to learn of events beyond their immediate surroundings, from local disputes to royal edicts or distant wars. In this way, the market was both practical and social, a place where food and goods circulated alongside stories, ideas, and traditions. Economic stratification was evident even within these lively spaces. Nobles and wealthy merchants often had dedicated stalls or favored positions near central squares, drawing larger crowds and commanding higher prices. Peasants and small-scale traders, meanwhile, occupied the fringes, working harder to attract attention and secure fair exchanges. Yet the market's egalitarian rhythm allowed for moments of social fluidity. Deals were made, favors exchanged, and occasional humor and mischief lightened the hard realities of medieval life. The seasonal nature of goods influenced not only availability but also diet. Fresh vegetables and fruits were rare outside their growing seasons, and what peasants did acquire often needed careful preservation for lean months. Techniques such as pickling, drying, and smoking were essential knowledge. Grains were stored in sacks, butter churned and salted, and meats salted or smoked to last through the winter. Markets provided the necessary materials for these preservation practices, creating a tangible link between the cycle of the seasons and the rhythms of daily survival. Markets were not without danger or challenge. Crowds were thick, and thieves and swindlers lurked among the stalls. Livestock could escape, goods might spoil, and disputes over weight or quality were common. Local authorities or guilds often attempted to regulate practices, ensuring fair measurement and quality control, though enforcement was inconsistent. Still, the benefits outweighed the risks, as the market provided the essential conduit through which peasants could access supplies, sell produce, and experience a taste of life beyond the village. Trade at markets could also have long-term consequences on local culture and cuisine. Exposure to new foods and ingredients subtly influenced medieval diets, encouraging experimentation and adaptation. For instance, the appearance of imported spices at fairs introduced a touch of novelty, even if only the wealthier could afford them. Likewise, imported fabrics, tools, and implements changed the rhythm and efficiency of work, indirectly impacting food production and household management. Markets were thus not merely commercial spaces, but vectors of cultural transmission, shaping medieval life in ways both immediate and enduring. Beyond the material and economic functions, markets provided a psychological reprieve. For a few hours, peasants could step outside the repetitive labor of planting, harvesting, or tending animals, immerse themselves in color, noise, and the bustle of human activity, and momentarily indulge in the pleasures of choice, variety, and social engagement. The market offered a brief but essential escape from the relentless demands of survival, reminding villagers that life, even in its harshness, could include moments of delight and community connection. As we reflect on the importance of medieval markets, it becomes clear that these spaces were far more than transactional hubs. They were lifelines connecting the rhythms of agriculture, diet, and economy with social and cultural life. They fostered exchange, communication, and resilience, shaping the experiences of peasants and merchants alike. The marketplace was a crucible where scarcity met ingenuity, where hunger met opportunity, and where human connection tempered the hardships of daily existence. In our next chapter, we will delve into medieval cooking methods and kitchen technology, exploring how these markets supplied ingredients that peasants and nobles alike transformed, however crudely or lavishly, into the meals that sustained and defined their lives. Step into a bustling medieval kitchen where the air is thick with smoke, the scent of roasting meat, and the pungent aroma of herbs steeping in pots. For the average peasant or noble household, food preparation was a labor-intensive endeavor, requiring not only skill but endurance and ingenuity. In the absence of modern conveniences, cooking relied heavily on open flames, rudimentary tools, and clever techniques that had been refined over generations. Kitchens were as much about survival as they were about sustenance. and the methods employed reveal a great deal about medieval life and the challenges faced by cooks across social strata. In peasant households, the kitchen was typically a multi-purpose space, often no more than a corner of the main living area or a small outbuilding. A hearth dominated the room, its open fire providing heat for cooking, warmth for the household, and sometimes even light for evening activities. Pots hung over the flames, suspended by iron hooks or placed on trivets above hot embers. Cooking techniques were straightforward, but effective boiling, roasting, and baking were the most common methods. A simple stew or pottage, consisting of grains, vegetables, and occasionally meat, was a staple. These one-pot meals allowed peasants to stretch limited ingredients into a filling and nourishing dish. The technology available to medieval cooks was surprisingly versatile, even if crude by modern standards. Clay or cast, iron pots, wooden spoons, and simple knives were standard tools, while baking ovens, often shared communally in villages, allowed for bread production. These ovens, constructed from stone or brick and heated with wood, required careful management of fire and temperature. Bread baking was both an art and a science. Too little heat, and the dough remained raw; too much, and it burned. For peasants, bread was often dense and coarse, yet it served as the foundation of nearly every meal, making the operation of these ovens essential to daily survival. In wealthier households and noble estates, kitchens were grander and far more complex. Large halls featured multiple hearths and specialized cooking stations, each designed for particular tasks: roasting spits for meats, cauldrons for soups and stews, and baking ovens for fine breads and pastries. Servants and cooks labored to feed large households, sometimes preparing dozens of dishes for a single meal. Wealthy kitchens also employed more sophisticated tools: iron spits that could be turned mechanically, large cauldrons suspended over adjustable chains, and knives, peelers, and ladles crafted for specific tasks. These kitchens were noisy, chaotic places where fire, smoke, and human activity intersected in a constant dance of culinary labor. Roasting was one of the most prestigious forms of cooking, particularly in noble households. A large piece of meat, often a pig, goat, or game animal, was skewered on a spit and turned slowly over the open fire. This method allowed fat to baste the meat, producing a tender and flavorful result. Peasants might attempt simpler forms of roasting, using small sticks over a hearth fire, but the results were often less impressive due to limited fuel and smaller cuts of meat. Roasting required vigilance, maintaining a consistent fire, rotating the meat evenly, and ensuring it did not burn or undercook. In noble kitchens, dedicated rotisseries and trained kitchen staff made the process more manageable, while peasants relied on ingenuity and experience to achieve similar results on a smaller scale. Boiling and simmering were the workhorses of medieval cooking. Stews, pottages, and soups allowed cooks to make the most of whatever ingredients were on hand, combining grains, vegetables, legumes, and occasionally meat into a single nourishing dish. Boiling also offered a practical advantage. It could kill some bacteria and make otherwise tough or fibrous foods more digestible. Herbs, onions, and other available seasonings were added to enhance flavor. Though for peasants, the options were limited to what could be grown locally or foraged from the surrounding countryside. Baking, while labor-intensive, was another cornerstone of medieval kitchens. Peasant households often relied on communal ovens, baking bread only once or twice a week. The process involved careful timing and skill. The fire had to be built, and then allowed to die down to produce an even heat. Dough was shaped by hand, and sometimes scored to ensure even cooking. Nobles, however, enjoyed more frequent and elaborate baking. producing delicate pastries, pies, and sweetmeats. Sugar, spices, and nuts were added when available, creating intricate flavors that were otherwise inaccessible to the lower classes. The division of culinary labor reflected broader social hierarchies, with access to ingredients and kitchen technology highlighting disparities between rich and poor. Preservation techniques were intimately tied to cooking methods. Salting, smoking, pickling, and drying were essential practices to ensure food lasted through lean months. Salted meats and smoked fish could be incorporated into stews or roasted for later consumption, while dried grains and legumes were staples of everyday meals. Kitchens served as both preparation and storage spaces, with careful organization required to prevent spoilage. Noble kitchens often featured separate rooms or cellars for storing preserved goods, while peasants made do with cool corners or underground pits. Despite these innovations, cooking in medieval times was fraught with challenges. Fires were unpredictable, utensils were limited, and smoke could make kitchens nearly uninhabitable. Labor was hard, with entire families often contributing to food preparation. For peasants, the process could consume hours each day, leaving little time for rest or leisure. Even in noble households, the effort required to produce lavish meals was immense, relying on a network of servants, apprentices, and specialized staff to meet expectations. Yet amidst the smoke and toil, medieval kitchens were spaces of creativity and resilience. Cooks adapted to seasonal availability, experimented with flavors, and devised clever techniques to make the most of scarce resources. While their tools and methods may seem primitive to modern eyes, they allowed people across social classes to feed themselves, maintain tradition, and sustain their communities in a challenging world. Kitchens were at the heart of survival, nutrition, and social cohesion, shaping both the diet and daily rhythms of medieval life. As we reflect on the ingenuity of medieval cooking, it becomes clear that the methods and technology of the time reveal as much about the people who used them as the food itself. From humble pottage to elaborate banquets, from smoky peasant hearths to grand noble kitchens, medieval cooking was a testament to human resilience and resourcefulness. And in our final chapter, we will explore the cultural and social impact of these culinary practices, examining how food shaped relationships, traditions, and identity across medieval Europe. As we step back from the smoky hearths, bustling kitchens, and humble peasant tables, it is worth reflecting on how the culinary practices of the Middle Ages continue to influence us today. While modern kitchens are filled with stainless steel appliances, refrigerators, and convenience foods, the foundations laid centuries ago shape the very way we approach food, flavor, and social gatherings. From preservation techniques to festive traditions, the echoes of medieval cuisine resonate far beyond the taverns, monasteries, and great halls of Europe. One of the most enduring legacies of medieval cooking is the focus on seasonality and local ingredients. Before global trade and refrigeration, cooks relied on what could be grown, harvested, or foraged nearby. Fruits, vegetables, grains, and herbs dictated the rhythm of meals, and this connection to the land fostered an intimate understanding of food cycles. Even today, the modern farm-to-table movement echoes this medieval principle, emphasizing fresh, local, and sustainable ingredients that respect the natural seasons. Preservation techniques developed out of necessity remain remarkably influential. Salting, smoking, pickling, and fermenting allowed medieval people to survive long winters and lean times. These methods not only extended the shelf life of food, but also created distinct flavors that have become culinary staples. Consider smoked herring, sauerkraut, pickled onions, or cured meats. dishes that have roots in medieval Europe but remain beloved today. Chefs and home cooks continue to experiment with these methods, often rediscovering flavors that were honed centuries ago, turning necessity into art. The medieval emphasis on hearty, pot meals also carries forward. Stews, pottages, and casseroles may seem rustic, but their practicality and nutritional balance remain relevant. The concept of combining grains, legumes, vegetables, and occasionally meat into a single nourishing dish informs countless traditional recipes across Europe and beyond. Modern comfort foods, from beef stew to risotto, owe a debt to these humble medieval beginnings. The simplicity and versatility of such dishes demonstrate the ingenuity of cooks who worked with limited ingredients, yet managed to create satisfying meals. Feasting, pageantry, and the social aspects of eating also trace back to medieval times. Royal banquets and noble gatherings were as much about displaying wealth and status as they were about nourishment. The elaborate courses, intricate presentation, and ceremonial practices have influenced how we celebrate special occasions today. From wedding feasts to holiday dinners, the idea of a meal as a communal and celebratory event has roots in the traditions of medieval Europe. Even the division of food into courses, the emphasis on table etiquette, and the pairing of specific foods with wine or ale echo these historical practices. The role of spices and imported ingredients, once a marker of status and power, has left a lasting impression on global cuisine. Medieval Europe's fascination with cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg, and ginger set the stage for centuries of culinary exploration. While such spices were once rare and prohibitively expensive, their popularity paved the way for the global spice trade and the diverse flavors we enjoy today. The pursuit of exotic tastes, so central to medieval elite dining, can be seen in contemporary gastronomy's embrace of fusion cuisine and international flavors. Even the challenges and shortcomings of medieval food have shaped our modern approach to hygiene, nutrition, and food safety. The lack of sanitation, adulterated ingredients, and poor preservation highlighted the importance of clean water, regulated food production, and understanding nutritional needs. These lessons, learned through trial, error, and sometimes tragedy, help pave the way for scientific advancements in diet, agriculture, and public health. In this sense, medieval struggles with food were not in vain. They informed centuries of progress that allow us to enjoy a far safer and more abundant diet. Yet, despite these improvements, there is a certain romance and fascination with medieval cuisine that continues to capture our imagination. History enthusiasts, reenactors, and chefs alike are drawn to the flavors, methods, and stories of the past. Medieval cookbooks, once the preserve of monastic scribes or wealthy households, have inspired modern adaptations, offering a tangible connection to the daily lives of people long gone. From recreating a pottage with root vegetables and herbs to roasting game over an open fire, exploring medieval cooking allows us to engage with history in a sensory and deeply human way. The resilience and resourcefulness of medieval cooks are also worthy of admiration. Faced with scarcity, disease, and unpredictable harvests, they managed to nourish communities, preserve traditions, and occasionally delight palates. Their creativity in stretching limited ingredients, inventing preservation techniques, and crafting meals under challenging circumstances speaks to a universal human desire to sustain and enjoy life through food. It is a reminder that even in adversity, culinary ingenuity thrives. As we conclude this exploration, it becomes clear that medieval cuisine is far more than just bland porridge or tough bread. It is a testament to human adaptability, ingenuity, and the enduring power of food to shape culture, society, and history. From the peasants who eked out meager meals to the nobles who staged elaborate feasts, the culinary practices of the Middle Ages left an indelible mark on the modern world. They remind us that every meal carries a story, a lineage, and a connection to those who came before. So, the next time you savor a perfectly baked loaf, a rich stew, or a tangy fermented vegetable, consider the centuries of knowledge, struggle, and creativity that made it possible. Medieval cooks, with their smoky hearths and rudimentary tools, may seem far removed from our modern kitchens. Yet their legacy is ever present in the flavors we cherish, the methods we use, and the rituals we celebrate. In understanding the food of the past, we gain not only historical insight, but also a deeper appreciation for the bounty, safety, and diversity of the meals before us. In closing, let us honor the medieval kitchens and cooks who labored over fire and smoke, who turned necessity into flavor, and who left a legacy that continues to enrich our plates and our lives. Though their meals were often humble, their impact is profound, reminding us that food is never merely sustenance. It is culture, history, and the enduring thread that connects generations across time.